Margaret Doyle stood frozen behind the study door, one hand pressed against her own mouth, listening to the man she called her husband laugh with another woman about her. "She's nothing but the price I paid for my father's silence," he said. Vivian laughed harder. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't scream. She turned, walked to her room, and began to pack before the sun could rise on one more lie. If you believe a woman's worth is never decided by the man who looks past her, hit subscribe now and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one. The candle in the hallway had burned down to nothing, and still Margaret Doyle stood outside the study door, unable to make her feet carry her away. She had only come downstairs for water. That was all. A dry throat in the middle of a hot Virginia night, nothing more. But the voices had stopped her. "You worry too much, Silas." Vivian Ashford's voice was warm. Honey poured over something sharp. "She'll never know." "She's not a fool, Vivian." "No," Vivian said, and Margaret heard the smile in it. "Just a mistake. A costly one, but a mistake all the same." Margaret's hand found the doorframe. She did not breathe. "She was never meant to last," Silas said. Quiet, certain. The same voice he used when he spoke of a horse that wouldn't break a field that wouldn't yield. "Boyd needed the marriage to close the deal. I needed Boyd. That's all it ever was." And now, a long pause. Margaret counted her own heartbeats in it. 4, 5, 6. "Now I have the land," Silas said. "The rest is just paperwork I have to live with." Vivian laughed low and pleased. "Paperwork doesn't sleep in your bed, darling." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Something in Margaret's chest cracked so quietly she almost didn't feel it happen. Not a shattering. A hairline fracture, the kind that runs silent through stone until the day the whole thing gives way. She had known somewhere beneath the part of her that still hoped that the marriage had been built on her father's debts and Silas Whitlock's ambition. She had known it the way a person knows winter is coming, as a fact distant and abstract, easy to set aside on a warm afternoon. But knowing a thing and hearing it spoken aloud, laughed about, dismissed as paperwork. Those were not the same wound. Margaret stepped back from the door. One step, then another. She did not run. Running would have made a sound, and a sound would have brought them both out into the hallway to see her standing there in her nightdress, with her face wet and her pride in pieces on the floor. She would not give Vivian Ashford that satisfaction. Not tonight. Not ever. She walked up the stairs, the way she always walked up the stairs, straight-backed, unhurried, a lady of the house, even when the house had never once been hers. Only when her bedroom door was closed behind her did she let her knees fold. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at her own hands in her lap, and she made herself stop crying by sheer will, the way her father had taught her to, still a trembling hand before signing a contract. A costly mistake. She said the words to herself once out loud just to see if she could bear the sound of them. She could. That was when she understood she was already deciding something. Her body had moved past grief and into motion before her mind had caught up to what her heart already knew. She was leaving. Margaret rose and crossed to the wardrobe. She did not reach for the silk gowns Constance Whitlock had ordered made for her, the ones with the fine lace collars, meant to announce to all of Virginia that Silas Whitlock's wife wanted for nothing. She reached instead for the plain traveling dress she had worn the day she arrived, the one that still smelled faintly of Boston salt air if she pressed her face to the collar and tried hard enough to remember. She packed light. A second dress, her mother's brush, a small pouch of coins she had saved from her allowance, coin by coin, for no reason she had let herself name until now, and her father's ledger. She held the worn leather book in both hands for a moment before she placed it in the bag. Thomas Doyle had kept his own accounts until the day he died, refusing to let a clerk near his numbers, and Margaret had learned his hand almost as well as her own from copying entries at his elbow as a girl. The ledger held every shipment, every debt, every payment her father's shipping company had ever made or received. She did not fully know why she needed it. She only knew she was not leaving it behind in a house where a woman like Vivian Ashford might one day decide it was worth burning. The wedding ring came off last. Margaret set it on the dressing table in the center, where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they came looking for her. Not thrown, not hidden, placed there deliberately the way a woman sets down a debt she has finished paying. She did not write a note. There was nothing left to explain that Silas Whitlock did not already understand better than she did. The back stairs of Whitlock Ridge creaked in only one place, third from the bottom, and Margaret had learned that months ago, the way a woman learns the temper of a house she is trying not to disturb. She stepped over it now without thinking, her bag clutched to her chest, her shoes in her hand so her feet would make no sound on the wood. The kitchen was dark and smelled of banked coals and yesterday's bread. She crossed it in 6 steps and let herself out the servant's door into a night so warm it felt like breathing through wet cloth. She had made it as far as the paddock fence when a voice stopped her cold. "Ma'am?" Margaret's whole body went rigid. Otis Graham stood near the stable door, a lantern turned low in his hand, an old man's face creased with more concern than surprise. He had worked the Whitlock horses for 30 years, had taught Margaret herself to sit a saddle properly, when Silas had been too occupied with land surveys to notice his new wife didn't know one end of a horse from the other. "Otis." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "I couldn't sleep. I only meant to—" "You don't have to lie to me, Miss Margaret." He said it gently, the way a man speaks to a spooked animal. "I got ears same as anybody in this house. Heard raised voices from the study earlier. Didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't kind ones." Margaret felt her throat close. "You goin' somewhere?" Otis asked, not accusing, just asking the way a man asks about weather. She could have lied. She almost did. "I'm leaving," she said instead. "Tonight, before he wakes." Otis studied her for a long moment, and Margaret braced herself for the argument, for the insistence that she return to bed and think on it in the morning light, for someone, anyone, to tell her she was being rash, that a wife did not simply walk away from a husband's house in the dead of night, no matter what unkindness had been spoken behind a closed door. Instead, the old man set his lantern on the fence post and reached for a saddle. "Girl your age out on them roads alone in the dark." He shook his head as he worked hands moving with the ease of long habit. "Ain't right. But I reckon staying where you ain't wanted ain't right either. You won't stop me." "Ma'am, I've been watching this house eat you alive one supper at a time since the day you arrived." Otis tightened the last strap and led a gentle mare out by the bridle. "This here's Clover. She's slow, but she's steady, and she won't spook if a fox crosses the road. Take her far as Cedar Hollow. Leave her at the Pruitt place. They'll see she gets back to me eventual." Margaret's eyes burned. "Otis, if he asks, then I'll tell him a horse went missing in the night, and I got no earthly idea how." He helped her up into the saddle with hands as careful as if she were made of glass. "Man like Silas Whitlock, he don't ask the stable hands much of anything. Never has. That's half his trouble." She looked down at him, this old man risking his position, and maybe worse for a woman he owed nothing. "Why are you helping me?" Otis tipped his hat back and looked up at her with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Because my mother used to say a house that don't value a good woman don't deserve to keep her. And I never seen my mother wrong about people, not once in 70 years. Margaret didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded instead and turned Clover's head toward the road and rode out from Whitlock Ridge, without once looking back at the house where she had spent 3 months learning exactly how small a person could be made to feel inside walls built to hold everything but her. The road to Cedar Hollow was long and dark, and full of sounds. Margaret had never learned to name the shift of something in the tall grass, the far-off call of a bird that might have been an owl, or might have been nothing at all. She kept Clover to a steady walk and her own spine straight, and she did not let herself cry again, because crying was a thing that could wait until she was somewhere no one from the Whitlock house could see her do it. Dawn found her still an hour from town, gray light bleeding up over fields she didn't recognize. And it was in that gray light that the full weight of what she'd done finally settled onto her shoulders. She had no home to return to. Her father was 2 years dead. His shipping company folded into debts she'd been told were unpayable debts that had made her a convenient bride for a man who needed her father's remaining harbor contracts more than he needed a wife. She had no mother living, no sister, no aunt who might take her in without asking questions Margaret didn't yet have answers for. She had a horse that wasn't hers, a bag with 2 dresses in it, and a ledger she couldn't yet explain even to herself why she'd taken. She kept writing. Cedar Hollow woke slowly around her. A blacksmith's fire catching a dog barking at nothing, a woman sweeping a porch who paused mid-stroke to watch Margaret ride past with open, unhurried curiosity. Margaret understood with the particular clarity of the exhausted that she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had left somewhere in a hurry and hadn't slept. She stopped first at the mercantile thinking she might trade a little coin for bread and information in equal measure. And it was there she learned how fast word traveled, in a town small enough that everyone's business belonged to everyone. "You're the Whitlock wife." The shopkeeper said it before Margaret had spoken a word, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. The plain dress, the unbrushed hair, the horse tied outside with the Whitlock brand plain on its flank. "Word came through not an hour past. Road ahead of you, seems." Margaret's stomach dropped. "I don't understand." "Miss Ashford's man came through at first light, asking had anyone seen a woman matching your description." The shopkeeper's mouth thinned into something unkind. "Said you'd taken off in the night. Took things that weren't yours to take." "That isn't true," Margaret said, and hated the way her voice shook, even though every word was honest. "I took my own belongings, nothing more." "That's not what I heard." A woman near the flour barrels turned to look at her now, and Margaret felt the room's attention shift toward her like weather changing. "Heard you ran off on a good man who gave you everything. Heard there's some question of a ring gone missing and other things besides." Margaret's chin came up before she'd decided to lift it. "I left the ring on my own dressing table," she said, steady now, steadier than she felt. "In plain sight where anyone might find it. If someone says otherwise, they are lying to you. And I'd ask you to consider why a woman with Vivian Ashford's interests would want this town believing the worst of me before I'd even had the chance to speak for myself." The shopkeeper didn't answer. He only looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided not to trust, no matter what proof stands in front of him. And Margaret understood in that moment that she would find no easy welcome in Cedar Hollow. Vivian's reach had come before her, and it had come dressed as sympathy for a wronged husband and suspicion for a runaway wife. She bought her bread with what little coin she had left after the shopkeeper's inflated price, and she led Clover out of town rather than ride through the center of it beneath every watching eye. And she told herself over and over that whispers in a mercantile were not the same as truth. But whispers, she was learning fast, traveled a great deal faster than truth ever did. Here. She found the Pruitt farm by asking a boy driving a wagon of hay, and Otis's name opened the door where her own could not. Sarah Pruitt was a broad, weathered woman with flour on her apron and no patience for gossip, and she took one look at Margaret's face and didn't ask a single question about Whitlock Ridge. "You look like you ain't slept nor eaten proper in a day," Sarah said instead, already pulling out a chair. "Sit. Talk can wait on a full stomach." It was the first kindness Margaret had been offered since she'd stepped out the Whitlock kitchen door, and it undid something in her that the whole long, frightened ride had not managed to touch. She sat at the rough wooden table and put her face in her hands and wept the way she had refused to let herself weep in front of Otis, in front of the shopkeeper, in front of anyone who might have used her tears as proof of guilt rather than grief. Sarah didn't tell her to stop. She only set a cup of something warm in front of her and waited hands folded until Margaret's shoulders had stopped shaking. "Man do this to you?" Sarah asked finally. Not unkind, just plain. "Yes," Margaret said. and a woman helped him do it. Figures. Sarah's mouth twisted. Always does take two, one to wound and one to sharpen the knife. Margaret managed something close to a laugh then and startled the first sound that wasn't sorrow she'd made in hours. "You can stay the night," Sarah said. "Longer if you need it. Lord knows this house has room, and I've buried enough men of my own not to have much patience left for the ones still walking around causing grief to good women." "I can't pay you," Margaret admitted. "Not much. Didn't ask you to." Margaret looked at this stranger who owed her nothing and had offered everything, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the study door began very slowly to loosen. So, back at Whitlock Ridge, the morning had broken hard and unkind. Silas Whitlock stood in the doorway of his wife's bedroom, with the empty wardrobe standing open behind him, and the wedding ring sitting cold and accusing in the center of the dressing table. And he felt something he had not expected to feel and did not have a ready name for. Not relief, though some distant ambitious part of him, the part Boyd had cultivated for years, whispered that relief might have been the appropriate response. The land was his now. The contract was signed. A wife who inconvenienced him with her presence had removed herself from the equation entirely, and by all the cold arithmetic he had built his life around, that should have counted as a solution rather than a loss. It did not feel like a solution. "She's gone," he said to no one, to the empty room, to the ring that caught the morning light like an accusation. Constance Whitlock appeared in the doorway behind him, already dressed, already composed, the way she had been composed through every crisis of her son's life, since his father had died and left her running Whitlock Ridge with an iron will and very little softness to spare. "Gone where?" she asked. "I don't know." Silas turned the ring over in his fingers. It was lighter than he remembered. "The stable boy says a horse is missing." "Clover." "Then she's on the roads alone at night like a common—" Constance stopped herself, recalibrating whatever unkind word had been rising to her tongue. "This will need managing. If word gets out that Margaret Doyle simply left, people will ask why. People will wonder what kind of husband drives a wife into the dark rather than keep her content at home." "Is that your concern?" Silas asked. "How this looks?" "My concern," Constance said with the particular chill she reserved for moments she considered her son to be behaving like a fool, "is that Harlan Boyd's entire arrangement depends on this marriage appearing sound to every party who signed on to that land contract. If it collapses in scandal, we do not merely lose a wife, Silas. We lose the harbor rights. We lose everything this marriage was meant to secure." Silas said nothing. He was still looking at the ring. He was thinking, though he would not have admitted it to his mother, of small things. The way Margaret always thanked the kitchen girl by name when Constance had never once in 30 years learned that girl's name at all. The way she had sat with old Otis for an hour one afternoon, asking him fool questions about horses she plainly had no real use for, simply because the old man's face lit when he talked. The way she used to look at Silas across the supper table with an expression he had been too occupied to properly read, and which he understood now too late had been hope. He had called her a costly mistake within these walls, not 12 hours past, certain she could not hear him. He was beginning to understand that some part of him had wanted her to hear it, had wanted in some cowardly corner of his heart for the decision to be taken out of his hands before he had to admit he'd been too much a coward to make it himself. "I'll send men after her," he said. "Send Vivian's man," Constance said. "He's already ridden toward Cedar Hollow this morning, spreading word she'd gone missing under troubling circumstances. Best let the story he's already telling be the one that stands." Something cold moved through Silas at that. "What story is he telling?" Constance's silence answered before her words did. "The one that protects this family's reputation, Silas. What other story would there be?" Vivian Ashford received the news of Margaret's disappearance in her sitting room with a cup of tea in her hand and something close to satisfaction warming her chest, though she was careful as always to arrange her face into an expression of appropriate concern before her maid could see anything else in it. "Gone," she repeated, testing the shape of the word. "Truly gone." "In the night, ma'am. Took a horse and some belongings." "How very like her," Vivian murmured, to make even her leaving into a small theft, so everyone will remember her as a woman who couldn't be trusted. She had not expected Margaret to overhear the study conversation. That had been carelessness. Silas's carelessness, leaving the door unlatched the way he always did when he thought himself too important to be interrupted. But carelessness Vivian was already deciding could be turned to purpose. A wife who fled in the night without explanation, without even the decency to wake the household and announce her grievances properly, that was not a wounded woman with a legitimate complaint. That was to any outside eye an unstable one. A woman unfit for the position she'd been given, running off at the first sign of difficulty, taking what didn't belong to her. It was, Vivian thought, turning her teacup slowly in its saucer, actually rather convenient. She had spent 3 months watching Silas Whitlock's eyes drift toward his quiet, watchful wife more often than Vivian found comfortable, not with love, not yet, but with something that unsettled her all the same. A kind of noticing. The way a man notices weather changing before he'll admit to himself that a storm is coming. Better, Vivian decided, that the girl be gone before that noticing grew into something Vivian could not undo. "Send word to my father," she told her maid. "Tell him the Doyle girl has fled Whitlock Ridge under a cloud, and that it would be a mercy for everyone's sake if the matter of her father's remaining harbor contracts were settled quickly before there's any complication in tracing where they properly belong, now that she's abandoned her position as Silas's wife." "Yes, ma'am." Vivian smiled into her tea and did not think even once of what it might cost a grieving young woman to have her name turned into a weapon by people who had never once tried to know her. It was Sarah Pruitt's kitchen, 2 days later, where Margaret finally opened her father's ledger and understood, with a slow and terrible clarity, why some instinct in her had refused to leave it behind. She had taken to going through it in the evenings, after the farm chores were done, partly for comfort. Her father's careful hand, still legible, after 2 years, still somehow him, still somehow present in a way his grave in Boston had never managed to feel. And partly because some restless part of her mind kept circling back to the conversation she'd overheard through the study door. Boyd needed the marriage to close the deal. She had heard Harlan Boyd's name before in passing, in the sort of offhand way a wife hears her husband's business associates mentioned at supper, without ever being told what business exactly was being conducted. She had assumed him some distant partner in Silas's land dealings. She had not known until she found her father's final entries, dated in the weeks before his death, that Harlan Boyd's name appeared there too. H. Boyd. Advance against November shipment, $4,200. H. Boyd note. Called full amount demanded within 30 days, irregular disputed. Cannot locate original terms of loan. Boyd claims verbal agreement. No witness. Margaret read the entries 3 times before the shape of it settled into something she could hold. Her father had not simply failed in business the way she had been told, the way everyone had told her gently at the funeral and after. He had been called in on a debt he insisted he did not owe, a debt, with no paper trail, no witness, nothing but one man's word against a dead man's ledger, and that sudden disputed demand had been enough to collapse a company that had stood solvent for 20 years. A company whose remaining assets, a harbor contract on the James River, valuable enough that a man like Silas Whitlock would marry a stranger to secure it, had passed in the settling of those manufactured debts into exactly the hands that had manufactured them. Margaret sat very still at Sarah Pruitt's kitchen table, with her father's ledger open in front of her, and felt something shift inside her chest that was not grief and was not heartbreak, though both of those things were still there, waiting beneath it. It was something closer to purpose. She had left Whitlock Ridge with nothing but her dignity, believing herself powerless, believing the only victory available to her was simply walking away with her head still high. She understood now, staring down at her father's careful, damning handwriting, that she was not powerless at all. She was, in fact, holding the one thing that men like Harlan Boyd and Silas Whitlock had never once imagined a woman like her might think to keep. Proof. "Sarah," she said quietly into the lamplit kitchen. "How far is it to a lawyer's office, a real one with no cause to answer to the Whitlock name or the Ashford name either?" Sarah looked up from her mending something sharp and approving flickering across her weathered face. "Further than a body ought to travel alone, but not so far a body couldn't manage it if she had good enough reason. Margaret closed the ledger and held it against her chest, the way she might once have held a Bible, and for the first time since she'd stood frozen behind that study door, listening to her own worth get laughed away. In another woman's voice, she did not feel like a wife who had fled in shame. She felt like a woman who had finally found the one thing in that house worth fighting to keep. She did not yet know what it would cost her to prove what she now suspected. She only knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like something solid, after months of standing on ground that had never once felt like her own, that she was done being the quiet, overlooked cost of other people's ambitions. Whatever came next, she would meet it with her father's hand, guiding hers across the page the same way it always had. And she would not be running anymore. Sarah Pruitt's rooster crowed at first light, and Margaret Doyle was already awake to hear it sitting at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open under a single candle, copying figures onto a fresh page in her own hand, so the original would never have to leave the farmhouse again. "You've been at that half the night," Sarah said, coming in with a basket of eggs balanced on her hip. "Girl needs sleep same as she needs bread." "I need this more," Margaret said without looking up. "If something happens to that book, Sarah, I have nothing. No proof, no case, no father's word against Harlan Boyd's. Just a widow's daughter with a grudge and a ring she left on a dressing table." Sarah set the eggs down harder than she needed to. "Then copy it twice. Hide one someplace only you know. Man like Boyd finds out you're holding something against him, he won't send a polite letter asking you to reconsider." Margaret's pen stopped mid-line. "You know him," she said. "Boyd. Everybody this side of the county knows him." Sarah's mouth went thin and hard. "Knew a family 2 winters back the Alcotts had a mill on Sycamore Creek. Boyd called a note on them nobody could ever find the paper for. Alcotts lost that mill inside a month. Man himself missing his court date to argue it on account of he took a fall from a wagon and never woke up right afterward. Convenient sort of accident, some said." The candle flickered. Margaret felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "Are you telling me to be afraid?" "I'm telling you to be careful," Sarah said. "There's a difference, and you'd do well to learn it quick." Margaret learned quickly because she had no choice left to learn slowly. She rose before the sun. Now not because Whitlock Ridge had ever asked it of her, but because Sarah's farm ran on a clock with no patience for a lady's habits. She learned to milk a cow without flinching at the animal's impatience, learned to judge a fair trade at the mercantile by the weight of a sack, rather than the shopkeeper's word, learned that a woman who counted her own coin twice before handing it over was a woman merchants respected rather than pitied. She was folding linens on the porch 3 days after the ledger conversation, when a wagon rattled up Sarah's drive and a broad-shouldered man in a battered hat climbed down without waiting to be invited. "Ma'am?" He tipped the hat toward Margaret, then toward Sarah, who had come out onto the porch with a look Margaret had already learned meant trouble. "Name's Cyrus Bell. I do some collecting work for Mr. Harlan Boyd." Margaret's hands went still on the linen. "We ain't got business with Boyd," Sarah said flatly. "Ain't here for you, Mrs. Pruitt." Cyrus's eyes slid to Margaret, and something in them made her skin prickle even before he spoke again. "Word's going round you might be sheltering the Whitlock woman, the one run off with property that ain't hers." "I took nothing that wasn't mine," Margaret said before Sarah could answer for her, and she was surprised at how steady her own voice came out, steadier than her pulse felt. "That ain't for me to judge, ma'am. Mr. Boyd, he's a patient man, but he don't care much for loose ends." Cyrus's gaze dropped just for a heartbeat to the ledger Margaret still held against her chest, and Margaret felt the whole world narrow down to that single glance. He'd take it as a kindness if certain family papers found their way back where they belong, save everybody a deal of unpleasantness. "Get off my land," Sarah said. Cyrus smiled unhurried and climbed back onto his wagon like a man who had already gotten exactly what he came for. "Ladies," he said, and touched his hat again and drove off without another word. Margaret stood on the porch with her heart slamming against her ribs. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I have the ledger." "Then we ain't got the luxury of waiting around," Sarah said. Time to go see that lawyer and go now. The lawyer's office in Danville was 2 days' hard ride from Cedar Hollow, and Margaret spent every mile of it with her father's copied ledger sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, the original hidden in the false bottom of Sarah's flour bin. A hiding place Sarah swore no man in 3 counties would ever think to check. Elias Whitfield's the only lawyer this side of Richmond fool enough to take on a case against Boyd's people. Sarah had told her riding alongside her on a borrowed mule, refusing to let Margaret make the journey alone. Lost half his clients doing it, the ones scared of crossing the Ashford name. But he's honest. Rarest thing you'll find in a courthouse. Whitfield's office sat above a dry goods store, a cramped room stacked floor to ceiling with papers that looked as though they'd never once been organized by any system a sane person could name. The man himself was younger than Margaret expected, sharp-eyed, ink-stained at the cuffs, and visibly unimpressed by the sight of a woman standing in his doorway with a farm wife at her shoulder and a bag clutched like it held her own heartbeat. "I don't take domestic disputes," he said before Margaret had finished introducing herself. "If your husband's cruel, ma'am, that's a matter for—" "This isn't about my husband," Margaret said. "This is about Harlan Boyd." Whitfield's pen stopped moving. "Sit down," he said. It took Margaret the better part of an hour to lay it all out: her father's death, the sudden debt with no paper trail, the harbor contracts that had passed into Boyd's hands, and from there, through her own marriage, into Silas Whitlock's. Whitfield listened without interrupting his expression, unreadable, until she finally opened the ledger and turned it to the page where her father's hand had written, "Cannot locate original terms of loan in ink, gone slightly brown with age." Whitfield read the entry twice. "Your father was a careful man," he said finally. "He was. Careful men make dangerous enemies of careless ones." Whitfield sat back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "I'll tell you plainly, Mrs. Doyle," Margaret said. "I'll not use his name any longer." Something flickered in Whitfield's eyes, respect maybe, or simple surprise. "Miss Doyle, then. I'll tell you plainly. I've seen Boyd's name on 3 cases in 5 years, always the same shape. A verbal loan nobody can produce paper for. A note called sudden, an amount just large enough to break a man, but not so large it draws attention from the county. And every time the property that changes hands lands somewhere useful to Boyd's interests or to men connected to him. Then it can be proven," Margaret said. "A pattern like that. A pattern's not proof, not in a courtroom where the judge dines at Councilman Ashford's table twice a month." Whitfield's voice was gentle but unflinching. "I'll be honest with you because I think you've had enough people lie to your face to last a lifetime. This is not a case I can win with a ledger alone. I'd need other families willing to swear to the same pattern. I'd need a witness Boyd can't buy or frighten into silence. And I'd need you prepared for what happens when a man like Boyd learns a woman is building a case against him, instead of simply grieving quietly and going away." Margaret closed the ledger and held it in both hands. "I've already had a man show up on the farm where I'm staying," she said, "threatening me without quite threatening me. I don't think quiet is a road left open to me anymore, Mr. Whitfield." Whitfield studied her for a long moment. "The Alcott family," he said slowly. "The mill on Sycamore Creek. You know of them. Sarah told me. There's a daughter still living. Rebecca Alcott, married now, keeping a house near Willow Creek. If she'd testify to what happened to her father alongside what happened to yours." Whitfield tapped the ledger. "It stops being one grieving daughter's grudge. It starts being a pattern a judge can't wave away, not even one who owes Ashford favors." "Then I'll go to her," Margaret said. "It's a hard ride, and harder still to ask a grieving woman to reopen a wound for a stranger's sake." "I'm not asking her to do it for a stranger," Margaret said. "I'm asking her to do it for every woman Boyd hasn't gotten to yet." Whitfield's mouth twitched something almost like the beginning of a smile. "All right, Miss Doyle," he said. "Let's build you a case." Stunned. Word of Margaret's visit to a Danville lawyer reached Whitlock Ridge before she had even finished the ride home, carried on the same fast current of gossip that had turned Cedar Hollow against her within a day of her arrival. Silas Whitlock heard it from his mother standing in the study, where 3 nights before he had spoken words he could not now unspeak, no matter how many hours he had spent since alone staring at the empty chair across the supper table. "She's seen Elias Whitfield," Constance said, and there was something new in her voice, something Silas hadn't heard from his mother before. Not simply irritation. Fear thinly disguised as irritation, the way Constance always disguised her fear. "Do you understand what that means? Silas Whitfield doesn't take cases he can't win. If Margaret's gone to him, she believes she has something worth winning." "What could she possibly have?" Silas asked, though even as he said it, some cold, uneasy thread was pulling tight in his chest. Some memory of a night 3 years past, when Boyd had first come to him with an unusual proposal. A marriage that would settle old accounts and secure new contracts in the same stroke. A debt owed by a man named Thomas Doyle that Boyd had assured him was simple and uncomplicated. He had not asked at the time why a debt so simple required a marriage to settle it rather than a straightforward payment. He was beginning to understand he should have asked. "It doesn't matter what she has," Constance said. "What matters is what it costs this family if she's allowed to say it in a courtroom. Silas, the harbor contracts are the foundation of everything we've built these last 3 years. If a judge so much as glances sideways at how they came to us, then perhaps," Silas said slowly, "we ought to know exactly how they came to us before someone else finds cause to ask." Constance went very still. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Silas said, "that I've never once looked at the original terms of that loan myself. I took Boyd's word for it. I signed where he told me to sign, and I married where he told me to marry, and I never once asked to see the paper behind any of it." "You had no reason to distrust the man. Harlan Boyd has been your father's associate for—" "My father is dead," Silas said sharper than he meant it, "and I am beginning to wonder exactly what kind of associate Harlan Boyd truly was to him." He crossed to the study desk to the locked drawer where he kept the contracts his solicitor had drawn up when the Doyle assets first transferred into his holdings, and for the first time in 3 years, he sat down and read them every clause with the careful, suspicious eye of a man who had built an entire fortune on precisely the kind of paper he was now afraid to trust. It took him until the candle guttered low to find it. A single line buried in the transfer documents referencing an original note held by H. Boyd terms as previously agreed. No date. No signature beyond Boyd's own. No copy of the note itself anywhere in the file. Silas sat back in his chair, the paper trembling faintly in his hand, and felt the foundation of the last 3 years of his life shift beneath him like ground giving way to water underneath. "There's no note," he said to the empty room, to the same silence Margaret had once sat in, night after night unnoticed. There was never a note at all. Rebecca Alcott's house sat at the edge of Willow Creek, small and neat with a garden. Margaret could see had been tended by careful, grieving hands, and when Margaret and Sarah rode up the path, the woman who came to the door had a wariness in her eyes that Margaret recognized instantly because she had begun wearing the same look herself. "We don't want trouble," Rebecca said before either of them had spoken. "Neither do I," Margaret said. "But trouble's found us both, whether we wanted it or not. My name is Margaret Doyle. My father was Thomas Doyle of Boston, and I believe Harlan Boyd did to him exactly what he did to your father." Rebecca's hand tightened on the doorframe. "I've spent 2 years trying to forget that name," she said quietly. "I know," Margaret said. "I'm not asking you to forget it now. I'm asking you to say it out loud to a lawyer who might finally be able to make someone else answer for it." For a long moment, Rebecca said nothing at all, and Margaret braced herself for the door to close for another kindness, refused another woman too frightened or too tired to risk what little peace she'd managed to rebuild. Then Rebecca stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said, "but you'll want to sit down for this. It's a longer story than you're expecting." It was indeed a longer story, and by the time Rebecca finished telling it, the sudden note, the missing paperwork, her father's fall from a wagon that had never sat right with anyone who'd known him as a careful, sober man, not given to drink or clumsiness, Margaret understood that Whitfield had been right about a pattern being harder to dismiss than a single grievance. But it was the final detail Rebecca offered almost as an afterthought that turned the whole shape of the case in Margaret's mind. "There was a man who came around after," Rebecca said, "before the mill was sold off proper. Said he was there on behalf of the buyer, making sure everything transferred clean. I remember his face because he had the kindest manner I'd ever seen in a man doing something so cruel. Introduced himself real polite. 'Whitlock, I believe he said. A young man come to look over the property on his father's behalf.'" Margaret's blood went cold. "Whitlock," she repeated. "Are you certain?" "Certain as I am of my own name," Rebecca said. "Why does that mean something to you?" Margaret sat very still, her mind racing back through 3 months of marriage, through every conversation she'd overheard about land and business and Harlan Boyd's arrangements, and understood with a slow, sick horror that the connection between the Whitlock family and Boyd's scheme against her father might run far deeper and far older than a single marriage contract negotiated after her father's death. "It might mean," Margaret said slowly, "that I've been asking the wrong question all along. I've been asking what Boyd did to my father. I never once asked what the Whitlocks knew about it while it was happening." Whitfield's office 3 days later felt smaller than ever, with 4 people crowded into it. Margaret, Sarah, Rebecca, and Whitfield himself poring over both ledgers and Rebecca's sworn account, when the door opened without a knock, and a man Margaret had never expected to see standing in that particular doorway stepped through it. Silas Whitlock looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Margaret," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice after everything made her chest tighten with an anger so immediate and so total she was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. "You have no right to follow me here." "I didn't follow you," Silas said. "I came looking for Whitfield on my own account, and your horse outside told me the rest." His eyes moved to the ledger spread across the desk, to Rebecca's stricken, wary face, and something in his expression shifted, uncertain, almost afraid. "I found the transfer papers. There's no original note, Margaret. There never was one. Whatever Boyd told my father, whatever he told me, it was built on nothing but his own word." The room went utterly silent. "You're telling me," Margaret said carefully, "that you already suspected." "I'm telling you I didn't want to know," Silas said, and his voice cracked on the words in a way she had never once heard from him in 3 months of marriage. "I told myself it wasn't my business to question a debt that predated my involvement. I told myself Boyd was my father's man, trustworthy by inheritance, and it was easier to believe that than to ask questions that might have cost me the harbor contracts I needed." "And how convenient," Margaret said, "that a debt requiring no proof also required marrying the debtor's daughter to a man who found her, in his own words, an acceptable price to pay." Silas flinched as though she'd struck him. Rebecca's eyes moved between them wide with a wariness that had nothing left to do with Margaret and everything to do with the Whitlock name sitting suddenly, unexpectedly in the same room as her own family's ruin. "You're the one," Rebecca said, slowly staring at Silas. "You came to our mill, after. Told us you were there on your father's behalf, making sure the transfer went clean." Silas went pale. "I don't..." He stopped, and something moved behind his eyes, a memory surfacing slowly, unwillingly. "I remember a mill, Sycamore Creek. My father sent me years back to inspect a property acquired through one of Boyd's arrangements. I was young. I didn't ask what had happened to the family who'd owned it before." "You didn't ask?" Rebecca said. "Because you didn't have to. Men like you never have to ask. The answer's already been arranged for your comfort before you even arrive to look at what's left." Whitfield cleared his throat into the silence that followed the careful, deliberate sound of a man choosing his moment. "This is, in fact," he said, "a very useful development." "Useful," Silas said bitterly. "Mr. Whitlock, your father's involvement in the Alcott transfer, combined with your own transfer of the Doyle assets under the same irregular terms, establishes precisely the pattern this case needed." Whitfield's eyes gleamed with the particular satisfaction of a lawyer watching a difficult case grow suddenly, unexpectedly strong. If you're willing to testify to what you've just told this room, testify against Boyd, Silas said. Against my father's oldest associate. Against the man who arranged half the contracts my family's fortune currently depends upon. Yes, Whitfield said simply. Silas looked at Margaret, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face that she had never once seen there during their marriage, not once, not even in their most private moments. If I do this, he said quietly, I lose everything Boyd's arrangements built, the harbor rights, half my father's old alliances, possibly the ridge itself if the debts underneath it are called before I can restructure. Then you understand, Margaret said, exactly what my father lost believing in a man's word instead of his paper. Welcome to the arithmetic, Silas. The words landed harder than she'd intended, and she watched them land. Watched something in him absorb the blow without flinching away from it. And for the first time since she had walked out of Whitlock Ridge in the dark, Margaret felt something other than fury when she looked at her husband's face. She felt unwillingly the faint and unwelcome beginning of respect. The ride back to Cedar Hollow was quiet. Sarah and Rebecca ahead on the road, Margaret falling back without quite meaning to, and Silas matching his horse's pace to hers, as though he'd been waiting the whole journey for the chance. I never called you a mistake, he said without preamble. That night, I never said those words. Vivian did. You didn't correct her, Margaret said. You let it stand. That's its own kind of saying, Silas. I know. He stared straight ahead at the road. I've had a great deal of time to sit with what I let stand these past days. More than I wanted. Good, Margaret said, and meant it without cruelty, only truth. I hope it's uncomfortable. I hope it keeps you awake the way it kept me awake every night in that house wondering what I'd done to deserve being spoken of like an inconvenient line in someone's account book. Silas was quiet for a long moment. You didn't do anything, he said finally. That's the part I keep circling back to. You never did a single thing to earn the way I treated you. I built a whole marriage on the assumption that you were simply the cost of a business arrangement, and I never once stopped to ask whether that assumption was fair, because it was easier not to ask. Easier to let Boyd's version of things stand the same way I let Vivian's cruelty stand that night. Easier, Margaret repeated, is a word men use when they mean convenient for themselves. Yes, Silas admitted. It is. They rode a while longer without speaking, and Margaret found uncomfortably that the silence between them now felt different than it ever had at Whitlock Ridge. Not the silence of a woman unseen, but the silence of two people circling the edge of something neither quite knew how to name yet. Why did you really come to Whitfield's office today? She asked finally. The truth, Silas. Not the version that makes you look like a man arriving at justice on his own account. Silas exhaled slowly. Because I looked at that empty chair at supper for the 100th time, he said, and I understood that I would rather lose the harbor contracts, lose Boyd's favor, lose everything my father built his fortune on, than spend the rest of my life the kind of man who let a good woman disappear into the dark, rather than admit he'd been wrong about her. Margaret said nothing to that. She wrote on her father's ledger safe in her bag, Rebecca's testimony safe in Whitfield's careful keeping, and let the word settle somewhere she wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. They were 3 miles from Cedar Hollow when the first sign of trouble reached them, a rider coming hard the opposite direction, and Margaret recognized Otis Graham's weathered face before she recognized the urgency in his posture. Miss Margaret. He reined in hard, his lantern still lit, though the sun stood high, a small detail that told Margaret he'd ridden through the night without stopping. Thank God, I've been searching 2 days. Otis, what's happened? Boyd's men, Otis said, breathless. They went to Sarah Pruitt's farm this morning while you were on the road. Tore through the flour bin. Found nothing on account of Sarah had already moved the original ledger someplace safer soon as that first man came around asking questions. But they know now, Miss Margaret. They know you're building something against him. Margaret's stomach dropped. Is Sarah hurt? Shaken. Angrier than hurt, knowing Sarah. Otis's eyes flicked to Silas, wary, uncertain of what exactly he was seeing: a Whitlock and a runaway wife riding side by side on a quiet country road, as though the world hadn't turned entirely upside down. But that ain't the worst of it. Tell me, Margaret said. Boyd's filed something with the county court, Otis said. This morning before any of this. Claims you stole property from the Whitlock household the night you left. Says he's acting on behalf of the family's interests, seeing as how Silas here ain't been available to press the matter himself, being too occupied, so the filing says with matters of his own conscience. Silas's jaw tightened. He's using my hesitation against her, making it look as though I've abandoned the claim so he can press it in my name without my consent. There's a warrant, Otis said quietly, for Miss Margaret's arrest should she be found holding property belonging to the Whitlock estate. That'd include, I reckon, whatever's written in that ledger you're carrying. The road seemed to tilt beneath Margaret for one long, terrible moment. He's turning my own evidence against me, she said. If they arrest me before Whitfield can file the countersuit before Rebecca's testimony is entered, then the case dies before it ever reaches a judge, Silas finished grimly. And Boyd walks free of every accusation you've built against him, and you sit in a cell for the crime of carrying proof of his own fraud. We have to get back to Whitfield, Margaret said, already turning her horse. Now before, there's men on the Cedar Hollow Road already, Otis said, watching for you. I came round the back way through the Pruitt fields to warn you before you rode straight into them. Margaret sat frozen on the road, her father's ledger heavy against her side. Her whole carefully built case suddenly balanced on a single question she had no ready answer for. Then how, she said, do I get back into town without walking straight into a warrant with my name on it? Silas's expression had gone hard and decisive in a way Margaret hadn't seen from him since the night she'd first watched him negotiate a land purchase across the supper table 3 months into a marriage she'd believed then might someday become something real. You don't, he said. I do. I ride into Cedar Hollow, I go straight to the magistrate, and I tell him in front of every witness who will listen that the woman Boyd's men are hunting is my wife, that any property she carries is her own rightful inheritance from her father's estate, and that I am formally withdrawing any claim against her, a claim I never authorized Boyd to file in the first place. Silas, it's the one thing I can do, he said, that Boyd can't twist into another lie. My name still carries weight in that county whatever else has changed. Let me use it for something that matters for once, instead of something that only ever served Harlan Boyd's arithmetic. Margaret looked at him, this man who 3 days ago had been a stranger she'd fled in the dark, who a week before that had called her a costly mistake, in a voice he'd believed she'd never hear, and found to her own quiet astonishment that she believed him. If you're wrong about this, she said, if this is another arrangement dressed up as rescue, then you'll have every right never to forgive me, Silas said. But I'd rather you believe me wrong for trying than watch you sit in a cell because I was too afraid to try at all. The ride into Cedar Hollow felt longer than any road Margaret had traveled since the night she'd left Whitlock Ridge, every mile stretched thin with the fear that Boyd's men might already be waiting, that Silas's name might not carry the weight he believed it did, that this entire fragile half-built case might collapse in a magistrate's office before it ever had the chance to stand. They found Whitfield first, and the lawyer's face when he heard the news of the warrant went sharp with a fury Margaret hadn't seen in him before. He's not trying to recover stolen property, Whitfield said. He's trying to silence a witness before her testimony can be entered. This is desperation, Miss Doyle, not strength. A man confident in his own paper doesn't need to arrest his accuser before she reaches a courtroom. Small comfort, Margaret said, if I'm the one sitting in the cell while he decides how confident to be. Then we make certain you're not, Whitfield said, already reaching for his coat. Mr. Whitlock, you say you're willing to withdraw the claim publicly. I am. Then we go to the magistrate together now, before Boyd's men have the chance to act on that warrant. A withdrawn claim witnessed by the county's own lawyer and confirmed by the husband himself leaves nothing for Boyd's warrant to stand on. The magistrate's office was small and close, and smelled of tallow candles and old paper. And Margaret stood at the back of it, her heart hammering, while Silas Whitlock did the one thing she had never once imagined him capable of doing when she'd first arrived at his estate as a stranger 3 months before. He stood in front of the county magistrate in front of 2 clerks and one increasingly uneasy deputy, and dismantled piece by piece the entire foundation of the warrant Harlan Boyd had built against his own wife. "The claim was filed without my knowledge or consent," Silas said, his voice carrying clean and steady through the small room. "Any property Mrs. Whitlock, Miss Doyle, carried from my household belonged to her by right of inheritance from her father's estate. I formally withdraw any claim against her, and I would ask this office to note for the record that Harlan Boyd filed this warrant while acting entirely outside the authority of my family." The magistrate, an older man with tired eyes, and the particular caution of someone who had clearly heard the Ashford and Boyd names invoked in his office more times than he cared to count, studied Silas for a long moment. "You understand," the magistrate said slowly, "that this puts you in direct opposition to Harlan Boyd, a man with considerable influence in this county." "I understand it perfectly," Silas said. "I'd rather stand opposed to Harlan Boyd than continue standing beside him." The magistrate's pen scratched against paper, slow and deliberate, and Margaret watched, scarcely breathing, as the warrant that had hung over her for the better part of a day was struck from the county's record with a few careful strokes of ink. "Warrants withdrawn," the magistrate said. "You're free to go, Miss Doyle." Margaret let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since Otis's lantern had appeared on the road that morning, and it was only then, in the release of it, that she allowed herself to look at Silas properly. Really look at him, and see for the first time not the man who had let Vivian's cruelty stand unanswered in a darkened study, but a man who had just stood in a public office and chosen her over every alliance his family's fortune depended upon. It did not erase what he had done. She was not. She told herself firmly foolish enough to believe one act of courage undid 3 months of quiet neglect. But it was she allowed a beginning she had not expected and had not asked for, and did not yet know what to do with. Outside the magistrate's office, the late afternoon light had gone long and gold across the street, and Whitfield fell into step beside Margaret, with the brisk energy of a man who'd just watched a case he cared about survive its first real test. "Boyd will not take this quietly," he warned. "A man who files a false warrant and watches it collapse in public doesn't slink away licking his wounds. He escalates." "I'd expect nothing less of him by now," Margaret said. "Rebecca's testimony, your ledger, and now Silas Whitlock's own admission of the Alcott Mill inspection. It's enough to bring formal charges. I intend to file within the week." Whitfield's eyes were bright with the particular fire of a man who'd finally found the case worth every enemy it might cost him. "But Boyd won't sit and wait for the court date, Miss Doyle. Men like him never do." "Then what will he do?" Whitfield's expression sobered. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd advise you not to travel alone from here forward. Not until this is settled one way or another." Margaret looked back toward the magistrate's office where Silas stood a little apart, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between hope and dread, the look of a man who had just spent every last coin of his family's alliances on a single wager, and had no way yet of knowing whether it would pay out. She did not know, standing in that gold evening light, with her father's ledger safe in her bag, and a warrant struck from the county record, and an entire case now built strong enough to shake a man like Harlan Boyd, whether she trusted Silas Whitlock. She only knew that for the first time since she'd stood frozen behind that study door, listening to her own worth get laughed away. She no longer felt like a woman standing alone against the whole weight of what had been done to her. And somewhere behind that thought, quiet and unwelcome, and entirely unasked for, she felt something that frightened her more than any warrant Harlan Boyd could ever file. She felt, despite everything, the first faint stirring of something that might, given time and proof, and a great deal more courage than either of them had yet shown, grow into forgiveness. She was not ready to call it anything more than that. Not yet. The morning after the warrant was struck from the county record, Margaret woke in Sarah Pruitt's guest room to the sound of raised voices downstairs, and her stomach turned over before her mind had even finished waking some old instinct from Whitlock Ridge, telling her that raised voices in a house she lived in never meant good news. She came down the stairs to find Otis Graham standing in Sarah's kitchen hat in his hands, his face gray in a way she had never seen on the old man before. "Otis, what's happened?" "Whitfield's office," Otis said. "Somebody broke in during the night, tore through every drawer he had." Margaret's blood went cold. Rebecca's statement, the copies of the ledger. "Whitfield's a careful man," Otis said quickly. "Kept the originals someplace else locked up tight where no fool with a crowbar could find them. But they took what they could find. Made a mess of the place. And they left something behind meant to be found." "What?" Otis's jaw tightened. "A note, addressed to you by name, said next time it wouldn't be paper that got torn up." The kitchen went very quiet. Sarah's hand found the back of a chair and gripped it hard. "He's threatening to hurt her," Sarah said, flat and furious. "Plain as that." "Whitfield's asking you come to his office soon as you're able," Otis said. "Says there's things need deciding and quick." Whitfield's office looked like a storm had come through it. Papers scattered across the floor. A chair overturned the lock on the strongbox, where he kept client files hanging broken from its hasp. Margaret stood in the doorway and felt something in her chest tighten at the sight of it. Not fear for herself, not entirely, but a slow-building fury at how casually Boyd's men had reached into a stranger's office and torn it apart, simply because that stranger had dared to help her. "I'm sorry," she said to Whitfield. "This is because of me. This is because of Harlan Boyd." Whitfield corrected sharper than she'd ever heard him. "Don't hand him credit for your own courage by blaming yourself for his cruelty. That's a trade he'd be delighted for you to make." He held up a folded paper, the note Otis had described, and Margaret took it with a hand that was not quite steady. "A woman who won't stay quiet finds trouble follows her wherever she runs. Best remember that before this goes further than paper. No signature. None needed." "He's not even trying to hide it's him anymore," Margaret said quietly. "No," Whitfield agreed. "Which tells me he's frightened. A confident man doesn't threaten. A frightened one does because he's run out of quieter ways to win." Silas arrived within the hour, having ridden straight from Whitlock Ridge the moment Otis's message reached him, and Margaret watched him take in the wreckage of Whitfield's office, with an expression that had gone hard and cold. In a way she recognized the same look he'd worn negotiating land purchases across her supper table, 3 months into a marriage that had felt then like nothing but obligation dressed in silk. "He threatened her directly," Silas said, reading the note twice. "This isn't posturing anymore." "No," Whitfield agreed. "Then we move faster than he expects." Silas set the note down carefully, as though handling it too roughly might somehow give Boyd satisfaction. "I've spent the ride here going through what remains of my father's old correspondence. There's more, Whitfield, more than the Doyle loan and the Alcott mill." The room went very still. "How much more?" Margaret asked. "I found letters," Silas said, "between Boyd and my father going back nearly 10 years. Arrangements my father made no effort to hide from me because he never imagined I'd think to question them. Land transfers. Debts called sudden on families who'd banked with my father's associates for decades. My father called it securing opportunity. I'm beginning to understand it was never anything but the same scheme over and over dressed up in different names." Margaret felt something twist inside her. Not surprise, not entirely, but the particular sickness of watching a suspicion she'd barely allowed herself to hold, confirmed in plain, damning language. "Your father," she said slowly, "built Whitlock Ridge on the same fraud that destroyed mine." "Yes," Silas said, and there was no defense in his voice, no softening, only a grim and open acknowledgement that seemed to cost him something to give. "I've spent 3 days telling myself I was innocent of what my father built, that I only inherited it without ever choosing it. I don't believe that anymore. I benefited from every dollar of it. I married you because of it. I don't get to call myself innocent simply because I wasn't the one holding the pen." Whitfield exchanged a glance with Margaret, the particular look of a lawyer recognizing in real time that his case had just grown a great deal larger and a great deal more dangerous than he'd first understood it to be. "If these letters exist," Whitfield said carefully, "and if you're willing to produce them." "I am," Silas said. "Whatever it costs." "Then understand what you're saying, Mr. Whitlock. This isn't simply withdrawing a claim against your wife anymore. This is testifying against your own father's memory in a courtroom in front of every family in this county who still believes the Whitlock name means something honorable." Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "My father is dead," he said. "His memory can survive whatever the truth costs it. I'm no longer certain I can survive being the kind of man who protects a lie simply because it's comfortable to protect." So, they did not have long to sit with the weight of that decision. The knock at Whitfield's door came sharp and sudden, and when Whitfield opened it, a young boy stood on the step, out of breath, clutching a folded paper. "Message for Miss Doyle," the boy gasped. "Man paid me a whole $1 to run it here fast." Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded it, and the words on the page made the room tilt around her. "Your farm woman friend has taken ill sudden. Doctor says it's poison, though nobody can say how it got in her food. Might be a body ought to hurry if she's fond of the old woman at all." "Sarah," Margaret whispered. "That's not possible," Silas said. But even as he said it, Margaret was already moving for the door, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. They rode for Cedar Hollow at a pace that left Margaret's lungs burning, and the whole way she prayed silently, desperately, that the note was another one of Boyd's cruelties, meant only to frighten her that Sarah would be standing on her porch when they arrived, hale and furious, and demanding to know why they'd ridden in so hard they'd near killed the horses. She was not standing on the porch. Margaret's stomach dropped through the floor of the world when she saw Sarah's neighbor standing in the yard, wringing her hands, and heard the words. Doctor's inside came quick as he could before she'd even fully dismounted. Sarah lay pale and sweating in her own bed, and the doctor, a thin, weary man Margaret had never met, looked up when she burst through the door with an expression that told her nothing good waited in whatever he was about to say. "Is she? She'll live?" the doctor said, and Margaret's knees nearly buckled with the relief of it. But it was close. Something in her supper near as I can tell. Not enough to be certain poison by nature, but enough that I don't believe it was accident either. "Who would do this?" Margaret whispered, though even as she said it, she already knew the answer. Already felt the cold, familiar shape of Harlan Boyd's cruelty in it. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, weak but furious. "Warned you," she rasped. "Man like that, don't wait around for a courtroom to hurt a body." "Sarah, I'm so sorry." "Don't." Sarah's hand found Margaret's wrist with surprising strength for a woman who'd nearly died hours before. "Don't you dare apologize for a wicked man's wickedness. You hear me? This is his sin, not yours. You go on and finish what you started. Don't you let him win by scaring you quiet." Margaret pressed her forehead to Sarah's hand and wept, and it was Silas standing quiet in the doorway who finally spoke, the thought Margaret hadn't yet let herself fully form. "This isn't a warning anymore," he said grimly. "This is Boyd telling us exactly how far he's willing to go. If he'll poison a farm widow simply for sheltering you, Margaret, there's no one left safe standing beside this case. Not Rebecca, not Whitfield, not you." So, they moved Sarah, once the doctor judged her fit, to travel to a small room above the Mercantile in Cedar Hollow, under the watch of 2 men. Otis trusted with his life, and Margaret sat in Whitfield's ruined office that evening, with a fury burning cold and steady in her chest. The fear she'd carried since fleeing Whitlock Ridge finally fully transformed into something harder. "He thinks fear will make me quiet," she said. "He's wrong." "Miss Doyle," Whitfield said carefully, "I would be a poor lawyer and a worse friend if I didn't tell you plainly, a man willing to poison an old woman is a man willing to do considerably worse to the woman he actually wants silenced. You need to consider whether this case is worth the risk to your own life. My father died believing the world would eventually right itself if he simply kept honest books and trusted the law to notice. Margaret said. It never noticed. It let Boyd walk free and let my father die, believing himself a failure for a fraud he never committed. I will not make my father's mistake and trust quietly that justice arrives on its own. I intend to drag it into the light myself, whatever it costs. Silas, standing near the window, turned to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between fear for her safety and something that looked unmistakably like admiration. Then we move tomorrow, he said. Before Boyd has time to plan his next move, I'll speak to Councilman Ashford myself, demand a formal hearing before the county court, present the letters, the ledger, Rebecca's testimony, all of it together in one sitting, before Boyd has the chance to isolate us one by one, the way he's already begun. Ashford is Vivian's father, Margaret said slowly. You believe he'll grant a hearing against his own daughter's interests? I believe, Silas said, that Ashford cares a great deal more about his own reputation surviving than he cares about protecting Boyd, once he understands how badly this could reflect on the councilman himself if it comes out that his daughter's household knowingly benefited from fraud. Men like Ashford don't defend their allies out of loyalty. They defend them only as long as it costs them nothing to do so. The hearing was set for 3 days later, and in those 3 days, Margaret discovered exactly how far Harlan Boyd was willing to reach to protect himself. Rebecca Alcott arrived at Whitfield's office on the second morning, white-faced and shaking her husband beside her, looking equally shaken, and the story she told made Margaret's stomach drop all over again. A man came to the house last night, Rebecca said. Said if I testified, he'd make certain everyone in 3 counties knew my father had been a drunk who'd gambled the mill away himself. That there was no fraud at all, only a man too weak to hold on to what he'd built. Said he'd find witnesses to swear to it, paid witnesses, and no one would believe a poor widow's daughter over 6 respectable men. That's a lie, Margaret said. Your father was never a drunk. I know that, Rebecca said, her voice trembling. But my husband has a business here, Margaret. Customers who'd believe whatever story got told loudest. If Boyd ruins my father's name a second time in front of the whole county, I don't know that we survive it, whatever the truth turns out to be. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath. The whole case felt Boyd's strategy laid bare in front of her. Not simply intimidation, but a calculated attack on every witness's ability to survive telling the truth. You don't have to testify, Margaret said quietly, though the words cost her more than she let show. I won't ask you to risk your family for mine. Rebecca looked at her for a long moment, and something in her tired, frightened face hardened into something else. My father died believing he'd failed his family, she said. I've spent 2 years letting that lie sit unchallenged because I was too afraid to fight it. I'm tired of being afraid, Margaret. If Boyd wants to threaten me for telling the truth, then let him. I'd rather lose the business than spend 1 more year letting a coward's threats decide what I'm willing to say. That evening, as Margaret sat going over Whitfield's carefully organized case files by lamplight, a soft knock came at the door of the room she'd been given above the mercantile, and she opened it to find Silas standing there alone, his expression uncertain in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I need to tell you something, he said. Before tomorrow. I should have told you the moment I understood it myself, and I've been a coward putting it off. Margaret's stomach tightened. What is it? Silas stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for a long moment he simply stood there, turning his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. My mother knew, he said finally. About the Doyle loan, about the missing note. I confronted her this afternoon after I found the last of my father's letters, and she didn't deny it. She's known for years, Margaret. She helped my father hide the same scheme from 6 families, including your own, because she believed protecting the family's fortune mattered more than the families it was built on. Margaret sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the weight of it settling into her chest like stone. Your own mother, she said. Constance knew what happened to my father, and she said nothing. Watched me marry into that house, watched me sit at that table every night not knowing, and said nothing. She said, Silas continued, his voice tight, that it was never personal. that it was simply how business was conducted among men like Boyd and my father, and that a woman's grief was an unfortunate but unavoidable cost of doing business. Unfortunate, Margaret repeated, and heard her own voice shake with a fury so total it frightened her. My father died believing himself a failure, Silas. Your mother watched that happen and called it an unfortunate cost. I know, Silas said. I have no defense for her. I'm not offering one. I'm telling you because you deserve to walk into that hearing tomorrow knowing exactly how deep this goes, and knowing that I intend to testify against her as readily as I intend to testify against Boyd, whatever that costs either of us. Margaret stared at him, and for the first time since she'd fled Whitlock Ridge in the dark, she found herself without words, entirely the fury and grief and something else, something that felt dangerously close to gratitude, tangled too tightly together to separate. Why would you do that? She asked finally. Testify against your own mother. There's no version of this that doesn't cost you everything, Silas. Your name, your fortune, your family. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Because I spent 3 months watching you sit across from me every night, and I told myself your silence meant contentment, when it meant you'd already learned that speaking up in that house cost more than it was worth, he said. I don't intend to become the next generation of Whitlocks who let a woman's pain go unanswered because acknowledging it was inconvenient. Whatever it costs me, Margaret, I'd rather lose it honestly than keep it built on my father's lies and my mother's silence. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been guarding carefully since the night she'd stood frozen behind that study door, and before she could stop herself, before she'd fully decided to say it, the words came out. I'm carrying your child, Silas. The room went utterly silent. Silas's hat stilled in his hands. His face in the lamplight went through something complicated and raw shock first, and then something that looked almost like fear, and then slower, something that looked like the beginning of a grief so old and so deep. Margaret hadn't expected to see it surface now, in this small room, in the middle of everything else, falling apart around them. Since when have you known? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A few weeks before I left, Margaret said. I hadn't told you. I wasn't certain I ever would, given everything I overheard that night. I wasn't going to let a child be born into a house that already knew how to make a woman feel like an inconvenient line in an account book. Margaret, I'm telling you now, she continued, before he could say whatever he was gathering himself to say, because tomorrow, if this hearing goes forward, if Boyd is as dangerous as he's already shown himself willing to be, I need you to understand exactly what's at risk. Not just my case, not just your family's fortune. A child, Silas. Our child. Silas sank slowly into the chair across from her, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at his own hands, as though searching them for some answer he hadn't yet found. I don't deserve to be trusted with that, he said finally. Not after everything. But I swear to you, Margaret, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever it costs me, I will not let that child grow up in a house that teaches them their mother's worth was ever a mistake. Dawn came too fast, and Margaret woke with her stomach in knots. Her father's ledger, and Rebecca's written statement, and Whitfield's careful legal arguments, all weighing on her like stones, as she dressed for a hearing that would either finally bring Harlan Boyd to account, or destroy every fragile thing she'd built since the night she'd fled Whitlock Ridge with nothing but a bag and a stolen horse. The county courthouse in Danville stood packed by the time they arrived, word of the hearing having spread through 3 counties on the same fast current of gossip that had once turned Cedar Hollow against Margaret, before she'd had the chance to speak a word in her own defense. She saw faces she recognized, the shopkeeper who'd doubted her, Sarah's neighbors, farmers and merchants, and their wives, all crowded into a room built for far fewer people than had come to watch. She saw Harlan Boyd himself seated near the front, composed and unhurried, dressed in a fine coat that made him look every inch the respectable businessman rather than the man who'd sent someone to poison an old woman for the crime of showing kindness to a stranger. And beside him, unexpected, cold-eyed and immaculate, sat Vivian Ashford. Margaret's stomach turned at the sight of her. At the easy, proprietary way Vivian's hand rested near Boyd's arm, and something in that small, careless gesture rearranged an entire understanding in Margaret's mind in the space of a single heartbeat. "They know each other," she whispered to Whitfield. "Not simply through the county's social circles. Look at how she sits with him." Whitfield followed her gaze, and his expression sharpened. "I'd wondered," he murmured, "how Boyd learned of your visit to my office so quickly that first day. I assumed a loose tongue among my own clerks. I begin to suspect the source ran considerably closer to home." The hearing opened with Whitfield laying out the case in careful, measured detail. Thomas Doyle's ledger, the missing original note, the pattern of irregular debts that had claimed both the Doyle Shipping Company and the Alcott Mill, the transfer documents from Silas's own estate that showed no evidence any legitimate loan had ever existed. Boyd's lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Richmond, rose to dismiss it all as coincidence, as the bitter fabrication of a grieving daughter and a widow with an old grudge against a successful businessman. "These are serious accusations," the magistrate said when Whitfield had finished, "built on a private ledger and the testimony of two women with clear personal motive to see Mr. Boyd disgraced. I'll need considerably more than grief and suspicion before I'll entertain formal charges against a man of Mr. Boyd's standing." Margaret felt the whole room's doubt pressing against her like weather, and it was Silas who rose next, and the courthouse went utterly silent as he crossed to stand before the magistrate. "I have letters," Silas said, "written in my late father's own hand, corresponding with Mr. Boyd over a period of nearly 10 years, detailing arrangements identical to the one that destroyed Thomas Doyle's company and Rebecca Alcott's family. I am prepared to enter them into the record, along with the transfer documents from my own estate, which show no legitimate note ever existed behind the debt Mr. Boyd claims Thomas Doyle owed him." A murmur swept through the courthouse. Boyd's composed expression flickered just slightly for the first time since Margaret had entered the room. "You're testifying," the magistrate said slowly, "against your own father's associate, against arrangements that benefited your own family's fortune." "I am," Silas said, "because I have come to understand that benefiting from a lie doesn't make a man innocent of it, only a coward for pretending otherwise." He entered the letters into evidence, and Whitfield walked the magistrate through them one by one, and Margaret watched the courtroom's doubt begin slowly to shift. It was Rebecca's testimony that changed everything. She stood before the court, pale but steady, and told the story of her father's ruin in careful, unflinching detail. The sudden note with no paper trail, the pressure to sell within a month, the fall from a wagon that had never sat right with anyone who'd known her father sober and careful his whole life. And then, unprompted, she added the detail Margaret hadn't expected her to include. "There was a man who threatened me 2 nights past," Rebecca said, her voice trembling but clear. "Told me if I testified today, he'd destroy what remains of my father's name and my husband's business besides. I believe that man was sent by Mr. Boyd, though he never gave his employer's name outright." "That is a serious accusation with no proof behind it," Boyd's lawyer interjected sharply. "I have proof," Whitfield said, and the whole room turned toward him. The man who threatened Mrs. Alcott was seen and identified by 2 witnesses as Cyrus Bell, an employee of Mr. Boyd's, the same man who visited Mrs. Pruitt's farm days earlier, demanding the return of Miss Doyle's ledger. I would further note that Mrs. Pruitt fell gravely ill from what her physician believes was deliberate poisoning only hours after sheltering Miss Doyle from that same man's threats. The courtroom erupted into a low, furious murmur, and Margaret watched Boyd's composure crack fully. For the first time, watched him lean toward his lawyer with something sharp and urgent passing between them. "These are outrageous claims," Boyd said, rising to his feet, his voice carrying a note of anger that hadn't been there before. "I've done nothing but conduct honest business in this county for 20 years. I won't sit here and be accused of poisoning old women and threatening widows on the word of a grieving daughter and a jealous wife." "I am not jealous," Margaret said, rising before Whitfield could stop her, her voice cutting clean through the courtroom's noise. "I am the daughter of a man you destroyed with a debt that never existed, Mr. Boyd. I have spent every day since fleeing my husband's house, not chasing revenge, but chasing proof, because I understood that men like you rely on grieving women, staying quiet out of exhaustion and fear. I am neither exhausted nor afraid any longer." The courtroom went dead silent. Boyd's face had gone hard and cold, all pretense of wounded respectability stripped away. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you've started, Mrs. Whitlock." "I have every idea," Margaret said. "I've started the end of whatever you believed you'd built on other people's ruin." It was in that charged, dangerous silence that Vivian Ashford rose from her seat and Margaret's stomach dropped at the sight of her. Certain some new cruelty was about to be unleashed. "If the court will permit," Vivian said, her voice smooth and composed despite the chaos around her. "I believe I can shed some light on Mrs. Whitlock's character that the court has not yet heard." The magistrate, weary and clearly eager for anything that might restore order, nodded for her to continue. "I was present the night Margaret left Whitlock Ridge," Vivian said. "I heard her husband and myself discussing business matters privately, matters that had nothing to do with her, and rather than confront us, honestly, she chose to eavesdrop and then flee in the dark, like a thief taking property and a horse that weren't hers to take. A woman capable of such deception in her own marriage is hardly a reliable witness against a respected businessman." Margaret felt fury rise hot and immediate in her chest, but before she could speak, Silas rose again, and something in his expression had gone past anger into something colder and more dangerous. "I believe," Silas said, "the court should also hear how Miss Ashford came to know so precisely what Mr. Boyd's man discovered at Mrs. Pruitt's farm days before, that information had any legitimate reason to reach her. I believe the court should hear how Miss Ashford's father's name appears more than once alongside Mr. Boyd's in my father's correspondence in arrangements that predate my own marriage by several years." Vivian's composed expression flickered just barely, but enough that Margaret saw it. "I have no idea what correspondence you're referring to," Vivian said. "Then perhaps," Silas said, "you'd care to explain why Cyrus Bell, the same man who threatened Rebecca Alcott and visited Sarah Pruitt's farm, demanding a ledger, was seen leaving your father's house 3 times in the past 2 weeks, according to 2 separate members of my own household staff, who I have already sworn to testify to the same." The courtroom's murmur rose into something closer to uproar, and Margaret watched Vivian's face, that carefully composed, endlessly confident face, finally fully crack. "You have no proof of any such thing," Vivian said, but her voice had lost its smooth certainty, had gone thin and sharp, with something that sounded for the first time like fear. "I have witnesses," Silas said. "I have letters, and I have a wife who trusted me enough, despite every reason not to tell me the truth about a night I should have defended her honor and did not. I will not make that same failure twice, Vivian. Not for you, and not for Boyd, and not for whatever arrangement the 2 of you believed would survive scrutiny." The magistrate called for order, his gavel cracking sharp against the rising noise of the courtroom, and when quiet finally settled heavy and charged, he looked between Boyd, Vivian, Silas, and Margaret with the weary, calculating expression of a man who understood he was standing at the center of something that had grown far larger than the property dispute he'd expected to adjudicate. "This court," he said slowly, "cannot resolve accusations of fraud, threat, and possible poisoning in a single afternoon based on testimony alone, however compelling. I am ordering a formal investigation, effective immediately, into the business dealings of Harlan Boyd, into the death of Thomas Doyle's shipping company, into the sale of the Alcott mill, and into the alleged assault on Sarah Pruitt. Mr. Boyd, Miss Ashford, you will both remain within this county's jurisdiction until this investigation concludes." Boyd's face had gone the color of old ash, and for the first time since Margaret had first heard his name spoken in a darkened study 3 months of her life ago, she watched the man look unmistakably afraid. "This is an outrage," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence, and the magistrate's gavel cut him off before he could say more. "You may address your outrage to the investigators, Mr. Boyd," the magistrate said. "This hearing is adjourned." The courthouse emptied slowly, the crowd buzzing with 100 versions of what they'd just witnessed, and Margaret stood on the steps outside, her whole body trembling with the release of hours of held tension, when she felt a hand close hard around her arm from behind. She turned, expecting Silas, expecting Whitfield, and found instead Cyrus Bell's cold, furious face inches from her own. "Mr. Boyd," he said, low and dangerous, "sends his regards and a message. This ain't over just because a magistrate ordered some paperwork. You do well to remember that ledger of yours can burn same as anything else." "Let go of me," Margaret said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it steady. "Or what?" Cyrus said. "You'll scream whole county's already watching you make a spectacle of yourself, ma'am. Won't take much for them to believe you're hysterical besides." She said let go of her. Silas's voice cut through the crowd like a blade, and Margaret felt Cyrus's grip loosen, just as Silas's hand closed hard around the other man's wrist, twisting it away from her with a controlled, furious strength that made Cyrus stumble back a step. "You touch my wife again," Silas said low and lethal. "And I will make certain the investigation that magistrate just ordered includes an inventory of every bruise you've ever left on a frightened woman across this county. Do you understand me?" Cyrus's eyes flicked between them, calculating, and whatever he saw in Silas's face made him step back fully, hands raised. "Didn't mean no harm," he muttered, though the words carried no real apology in them. "Just delivering a message." "Deliver this one back," Silas said. "Tell Boyd that whatever threats he's got left, he'd better use them fast, because the investigation he's so afraid of started the moment he sent you to poison an old woman for the crime of showing kindness." Cyrus disappeared into the crowd, and Margaret stood shaking on the courthouse steps, Silas's hand still steady at her elbow, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke at all. "Are you hurt?" Silas asked finally. "No," Margaret said. "Frightened, furious, but not hurt." "Boyd's investigation will take weeks, possibly months," Silas said quietly. "He knows that, which means he has weeks, possibly months, to try to make this go away before it reaches its conclusion. That's not a comfort, Margaret. That's a warning." Margaret looked out at the crowd still murmuring on the courthouse lawn at Vivian Ashford, climbing into a carriage with her face carved from stone at Harlan Boyd, disappearing into the gathering evening with two of his men flanking him like guards, and understood with a cold and steady clarity that the hearing they'd just survived was not an ending. It was only, she realized, the moment Harlan Boyd finally understood he had something left to lose. And a man like that, cornered and afraid, was more dangerous than he had ever been standing confident and unchallenged. "Then we don't give him weeks," Margaret said. "We don't give him time to plan anything at all." They did not sleep that night. Whitfield's office, still bearing the scars of the break-in, became a war room by lamplight, papers spread across every surface, and Margaret sat at the center of it, with her father's ledger open in front of her, forcing her exhausted mind to keep working, even as her body begged for rest. "An investigation ordered by the magistrate moves at the county's pace," Whitfield said, pacing the narrow floor. "Weeks easily. Longer if Boyd has friends among the investigators, which a man like him surely does. We need something faster. Something that doesn't give him room to maneuver." "The bank?" Silas said, suddenly looking up from a stack of his father's old letters. "Boyd's arrangements all ran through the Danville Trust. If there's a pattern of debts called without proper documentation, the bank's own records would show it deposits withdrawals the timing of each transfer against the timing of each family's ruin. Bank records are private," Whitfield said. "We'd need a court order to access them, and that's precisely the kind of order a friendly judge could delay indefinitely." "Not if the bank's own president wants them examined," Silas said. "Jonas Pratt owes my family a debt of his own, an old one, nothing shameful, simply a favor from my grandfather's time that's never been called. I intend to call it now." Margaret watched him rise, already reaching for his coat, and felt something complicated move through her gratitude, tangled with a wariness she couldn't quite set down even now. "You're certain he'll help you," she said, "even against Boyd?" "I'm certain," Silas said, "that Jonas Pratt values his own reputation more than his friendship with a man now under formal investigation for fraud and assault. Men like Pratt don't choose loyalty, Margaret. They choose whichever side looks less likely to sink." Jonas Pratt's office sat above the Danville Trust itself, and the banker who received them at such an ungodly hour looked considerably less pleased to see Silas Whitlock than Silas had predicted. "You understand what you're asking," Pratt said once Silas had laid out the request. Opening Boyd's accounts to scrutiny in the middle of a formal investigation based on nothing but your own suspicion. Based on 10 years of letters in my father's hand, Silas said, setting the bundle on Pratt's desk, detailing exactly how these debts were manufactured. I'm not asking you to take a risk on suspicion, Jonas. I'm asking you to protect this bank's reputation before Boyd's fraud drags it down with him. If it comes out that Danville Trust processed a decade of manufactured debts without ever questioning the paperwork, this bank won't survive the scandal any better than Boyd will. Pratt's face went through several careful calculations, and Margaret watched the exact moment self-interest won out over old loyalty. I'll need until morning, Pratt said. The full records going back that far aren't kept in this office. Morning is faster than weeks, Whitfield said. We'll take it. They did not have until morning. The messenger arrived at Whitfield's office past midnight, breathless, and the news he carried sent Margaret's stomach into a cold, plummeting drop. Danville Trust! The boy gasped. Fire broke out in the record room not 2 hours past. Whole east wings burned. Nobody's saying yet how it started. Whitfield's face went ashen. The records. If Boyd's ledgers, Pratt's already sent word, the boy continued. Says there's men saying they saw somebody running from the building right before the smoke started. Description matches, a fellow works for Mr. Boyd. Silas was on his feet before the boy finished speaking, his jaw set hard. He's burning the evidence before we can reach it, Silas said. Whatever proof existed in those bank records, it's gone now, or it will be by morning. Not all of it, Margaret said, and something in her voice made the room go still. Pratt agreed to examine the records tonight before the fire. If he found anything in those first hours, then we need to reach him before Boyd's men finish what they started, Whitfield said grimly. The Danville Trust building stood half-swallowed in smoke and firelight when they arrived, a bucket line of townsfolk working desperately against flames that had already claimed the east wing entire, and Margaret stood in the chaos of it with her heart hammering, searching the crowd for any sign of Jonas Pratt. She found him near the front steps, soot-streaked, coughing, clutching a single scorched ledger against his chest, like it was the only thing he'd managed to save from a burning house. Mr. Pratt, Margaret called, pushing through the crowd. Are you hurt? No, Pratt gasped. No, I was still in the record room when the fire started. Smelled the smoke before I saw flame. Grabbed what I could on my way out. He held up the ledger, its edges black and curling, but its pages Margaret saw with a rush of desperate hope, largely intact. Boyd's accounts? Pratt said. The years you asked about. I'd only just begun going through them when the fire started, but I saw enough, Mrs. Whitlock. Enough to know your suspicions weren't suspicions at all. What did you see? Silas asked urgently. Deposits? Pratt said, still catching his breath. Made to Boyd's account within days of every debt he called sudden against a family in this county. Same pattern over and over going back near 10 years. And payments made out from Boyd's account to a second party regular as clockwork every time. He looked up, meeting Silas's eyes with something grim and apologetic. Payments to your father, Mr. Whitlock, and more recent ones since your father's passing, to an account held under your mother's name. The words landed like a physical blow. My mother, Silas said, his voice gone hollow, has been receiving payments from Boyd since my father died. I only saw the ledger for a matter of minutes before the smoke drove me out. Pratt said, but yes, regular payments continuing to the present. If I had to guess the arrangement, Mr. Whitlock, I'd say your mother has known considerably more about Boyd's scheme than simple awareness. I'd say she's been profiting from it directly all this time. You believed yourself only inheriting a fortune built on old sins. Margaret watched Silas absorb this, watched his face go through shock, and then something colder, harder, a fury she hadn't seen from him even in the courtroom. She's still taking his money, Silas said quietly, even now, even after everything. They confronted Constance Whitlock that same night, the scorched ledger in Pratt's careful keeping, and Margaret stood at Silas's side in the Whitlock Ridge study, the same room where she had once stood frozen behind a door, listening to her own worth. Get laughed away, and watched her husband demand answers from his own mother, with a directness that Margaret understood now had cost him everything he'd once believed about his family. Payments, Silas said, laying the account details before her. Regular ongoing from Boyd's account to yours. Explain it to me, Mother, now, before I let Whitfield explain it to the county instead. Constance's composed expression did not crack easily, but Margaret watched it strain under the weight of evidence too specific to deny. Your father built arrangements that protected this family, Constance said finally, her voice tight and cold. When he died, those arrangements did not simply cease to exist. Boyd continued honoring the old understanding, and I continued receiving what this family was owed for decades of loyal partnership. Owed, Margaret said, unable to hold her tongue any longer. You call it owed. My father is dead, Constance. Rebecca Alcott's father is dead. Both of them destroyed by the same scheme you've been quietly profiting from every month since your husband died, all while sitting across from me at supper, watching me not know a single thing about the debt that had bought my own marriage. Constance's eyes flicked to Margaret, cold and unrepentant. I never asked for your understanding, girl. I asked only that you play the role you were given with enough grace to preserve this family's standing. You failed even at that. Enough, Silas said, sharp enough that both women turned to him. Mother, I am formally severing this family's arrangement with Harlan Boyd effective tonight. I will testify to every payment in that ledger, and I will not protect you from whatever consequence follows, because I am done protecting lies that cost other families everything, while this one profited quietly in the dark. You would destroy your own mother's reputation, Constance said, for the sake of a woman you married as a business arrangement. I would destroy my own comfort, Silas said, for the sake of finally becoming a man worth the name my father left me instead of the coward who inherited his sins and called it inheritance. Constance stared at her son for a long moment, something flickering behind her carefully composed face that might, in a woman less practiced at concealment, have been fear. You'll regret this, she said finally, when the money's gone and the ridge is sold to cover whatever debts come calling. Once Boyd's scheme collapses entirely, you'll regret standing here tonight throwing away everything your father built. I already regret, Silas said quietly. Every night I sat at that table and let a good woman believe herself unwanted, because I was too comfortable in what your husband's lies had bought me to ask a single honest question. I'll take the regret of losing a fortune over that regret any day, Mother. Whitfield entered the burned ledger into the investigation the following morning, and word of Constance Whitlock's payments from Harlan Boyd spread through the county faster than the fire that had nearly destroyed the evidence of it, turning what had already been a scandal into something closer to a reckoning. Boyd cornered now on every side. The magistrate's investigation, Pratt's testimony, the surviving bank ledger. Silas's public break with his own mother grew desperate in a way that Margaret watched unfold with a wariness that never fully left her, even as the case built stronger by the day. It was Otis who brought the next piece of news, arriving at Whitfield's office 3 days after the fire, with an urgency that told Margaret before he'd said a word that trouble had found them again. Boyd's selling off, Otis said. Land holdings, everything he can move quick and quiet. Word at the stable is he's making arrangements to leave the county entire soon as he can manage it without drawing more suspicion than he's already carrying. He's running, Whitfield said, before the investigation concludes. If he leaves before formal charges are filed, Margaret said, feeling the old fear rise cold in her chest. He takes whatever fortune remains and starts the same scheme somewhere new, where no one knows his name yet. Then we make certain he doesn't get the chance, Silas said. Whitfield, how fast can you petition the magistrate for an emergency order freezing Boyd's remaining assets pending the investigation's conclusion? Fast if I file this morning, Whitfield said, already reaching for his coat. But Miss Doyle? He glanced at Margaret, uncertain how to phrase what came next. A man cornered with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than a man simply defending his fortune. If Boyd believes he has no path left but flight, and we cut that path off, he'll do something desperate. Margaret finished. "I understand the risk, Mr. Whitfield. I understood it the night I overheard my own worth discussed like a line in an account book. I'm not turning back now for fear of what a cornered man might do." The emergency order was granted within hours, Boyd's remaining assets frozen pending the investigation, and for one brief cautious evening, Margaret allowed herself to believe the worst of it might finally be behind them. She was wrong. The message came just past dusk, carried by a boy who wouldn't give his name, and the moment Margaret unfolded it, her whole body went cold, with a fear sharper than anything Boyd's earlier threats had managed to produce. "Come alone to the old mill road past the bend where Sycamore Creek turns. Bring the original ledger, nothing else. If you bring the sheriff, if you bring your husband, I'll make certain the whole county learns exactly what kind of woman abandons a dying friend's warning to chase her own vengeance. You have 1 hour, no signature, none needed." Margaret's hands shook as she read it twice, and Silas, watching her face, crossed the room in 3 quick strides. "What is it?" "Boyd," Margaret said. "He wants the original ledger. Says I'm to come alone or he'll—" She stopped, unable to finish the threat, though its shape was clear enough without the words. "You're not going alone," Silas said immediately. "He'll know if you follow," Margaret said. "He's watched this house, watched Whitfield's office, watched every move we've made for weeks. If I bring anyone, if I bring the sheriff—" "Then we don't tell him we're coming," Silas said. "We simply are." "Wow." Margaret rode toward the old mill road as the last light faded from the sky, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The original ledger copied twice now, hidden in 3 separate places. The version she carried tonight, deliberately incomplete, missing the crucial pages, Whitfield had insisted she leave behind, wrapped carefully in oilcloth against her chest. She had insisted on going forward with the meeting against Silas's every objection because she understood something none of them had fully said aloud. A man as cornered as Boyd now was would not simply vanish quietly if his one demand went unanswered. He would escalate, and Margaret would rather face that danger on ground she'd chosen than wait helpless for it to find Sarah's sickbed, or Rebecca's family, or some other innocent caught in the wreckage of Boyd's desperation. She was not, however, foolish enough to go entirely unprotected. Silas rode a half-mile behind, close enough to reach her, quickly far enough to remain unseen from the mill road itself, and Otis had gone ahead an hour earlier, slipping through the trees on foot, with the quiet, patient skill of a man who'd spent 30 years learning land. Boyd's people had never bothered to walk themselves. The old mill stood dark and silent against the last purple light of evening when Margaret arrived, and Harlan Boyd stepped out from its shadow alone. Or so it appeared, his composed businessman's face gone hard and desperate in a way that frightened her more than any threat he'd yet made. "You came," he said. "Wise of you." "I came," Margaret said, keeping her voice steadier than her pulse, "because I'm tired of men like you deciding what a frightened woman will and won't do. Where's the ledger you want, Mr. Boyd? I'd like this finished. Straight to business. I admire that, actually." Boyd's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Your father had the same directness before the end. Shame it didn't serve him any better than it's likely to serve you." "You admit it then," Margaret said, "that there was never a legitimate debt, that you destroyed my father over a lie." "I admit," Boyd said, "that your father was foolish enough to trust a verbal arrangement without demanding proper paper, same as half the fools in this county have been foolish enough to trust me over the years. That's not fraud, Mrs. Whitlock. That's simply business conducted with men too proud to protect themselves properly." "It's fraud," Margaret said, "and you know it, and soon enough the whole county will know it too, whatever happens here tonight." Boyd's expression flickered, the mask of calm businessman slipping just enough to show the desperation underneath. "The ledger," he said. "Now, or I promise you, Mrs. Whitlock, the consequences will extend considerably further than your own reputation." Margaret held the oilcloth-wrapped book toward him, and as Boyd stepped forward to take it, she heard from the darkness behind the mill the unmistakable sound of a hammer drawing back on a pistol. "That's far enough, Boyd." Silas's voice cut through the evening cold and steady, and Margaret watched Boyd's face go white with a fury and fear, so total it seemed to age him a decade in the space of a single heartbeat. "You said you'd come alone," Boyd hissed at Margaret. "I lied?" Margaret said. "Same as you've been lying to this whole county for 10 years, Mr. Boyd. Seemed only fitting." Boyd's hand moved fast toward his coat, and for one terrible frozen moment, Margaret's whole body went cold with the certainty that she'd misjudged the danger that this desperate cornered man had come prepared for violence rather than negotiation. "Don't," Silas said, his own pistol steady-stepping fully into the clearing now. "Whatever's in that coat, Boyd, think carefully before your hand finishes moving." Boyd froze, his hand still hovering near his coat, his eyes darting between Silas's leveled pistol and Margaret's still careful stillness. "You'd shoot me," Boyd said, over a ledger. "I'd shoot you," Silas said, "to protect my wife and my unborn child from a man who's already poisoned one woman and threatened 2 others. Make your choice, Boyd, but make it slow." Boyd's hand fell away from his coat, and something in his shoulders sagged, the last of his composure finally fully collapsing. "It was never meant to go this far," he said, and for the first time since Margaret had learned his name, she heard something almost human in his voice. Not remorse, not quite, but a weary, defeated exhaustion. A debt called here, a mill sold there. Small things spread out over years, easy enough to justify one arrangement at a time. "I never intended to become a man hunted through his own county by a widow's daughter and her husband's pistol. You intended," Margaret said, "to become rich off other people's ruin, and you never once stopped to consider what it cost the families you destroyed along the way, until the ruin finally circled back close enough to threaten you directly." Boyd said nothing to that. There was, Margaret understood, nothing left for him to say. It was Otis who emerged from the trees a moment later, another lantern in hand, 2 of the sheriff's deputies close behind him, men Silas had quietly arranged to follow at a careful distance, close enough to reach the mill within minutes of any trouble, exactly as they had. "Harlan Boyd," one of the deputies said, stepping forward with a length of rope in hand. "You're under arrest pending the magistrate's investigation into fraud, assault, and attempted extortion." Boyd did not resist. He simply stood there, in the last light of a day that had cost him everything he'd spent 10 years building, and let the deputies bind his hands without a single word of protest. Margaret watched them lead him away, and felt to her own quiet surprise, not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more solid, the particular relief of a fear finally fully lifted, of a threat that had followed her every waking hour for weeks, finally rendered powerless. Vivian Ashford's arrest followed 2 days later, once the investigation's findings made clear how deeply she'd been entangled in Boyd's scheme, not simply a bystander to her father's old alliances, but an active participant, the payments traced through her own accounts as clearly as they'd been traced through Constance Whitlock's. Margaret did not attend that particular arrest. She had by then no need to watch Vivian's downfall in person to feel the satisfaction of it. The news reaching her secondhand through Whitfield's careful, measured account was enough. "She's claiming innocence, of course," Whitfield said, arriving at Sarah Pruitt's recovering bedside with the news. "Claims she knew nothing of her father's arrangements, that any payments through her accounts were simply gifts from a doting father. I doubt the magistrate finds that explanation any more convincing than I do." "And Constance?" Margaret asked. "Formally named in the investigation," Whitfield said. "Whether she faces criminal charges or simply the ruin of her reputation and fortune remains to be seen. But I suspect for a woman like Constance Whitlock, the second may prove nearly as devastating as the first." Sarah, propped up against pillows, still pale, but steadily recovering, managed a thin, satisfied smile. "Good," she said. Let her sit with the same kind of ruin she was so willing to watch other families suffer. Chanchapuag. It was nearly a week later, the investigation still ongoing, but Boyd and Vivian both formally charged Constance's fortune frozen pending further inquiry, when Margaret finally found herself alone with Silas, for the first time since the confrontation at the mill. They stood in the garden at Whitlock Ridge, A garden Margaret had once walked through as a stranger in her own marriage, unnoticed, unremarkable, a decoration in a house that had never once felt like hers. And the evening was warm and quiet in a way that felt, after weeks of fear and fury, almost unfamiliar. "The ridge will need to be sold, in part," Silas said quietly. "Once the investigation concludes, and whatever debts trace back to Boyd's arrangements come due, honestly, there won't be enough left to maintain the estate as it stood. I'll likely need to sell off half the land, find honest work I never imagined myself doing." "Does that frighten you?" Margaret asked. Silas considered the question seriously, the way she'd noticed he considered most things now, a careful weighing she hadn't seen from him in the early months of their marriage, when every answer had come quick and certain and entirely without doubt. "It should, I think," he said finally. "A man raised to inherit everything ought to be frightened at the prospect of inheriting nothing. But mostly I feel something closer to relief. Whatever I build from here, it will be mine honestly built on my own labor instead of my father's lies. I find I'd rather have less built honest than everything I had before built on other people's ruin." Margaret studied him for a long moment. This man who had once let cruelty stand unanswered in a darkened study, who had transformed slowly, and at considerable cost to himself, into someone willing to stand between her and a loaded threat, willing to testify against his own mother, willing to lose everything rather than protect a lie a moment longer. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly, honestly. "Not fully. Not yet. What you let stand that night, what 3 months of silence taught me about my own worth in that house that doesn't undo itself simply because you've since done difficult, honorable things. I don't expect it to," Silas said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Margaret. I'm only asking for the chance to keep earning something better than what I gave you before for as long as it takes, without demanding you grant it before I've proven I mean to keep trying." Margaret looked out at the garden, at the last gold light settling over land that would soon no longer be entirely his, and felt something in her chest, guarded. Still careful, still but no longer entirely closed, shift toward something she wasn't yet ready to name. "That," she said finally, "I can allow. Time. Not certainty. Not yet." "Time," Silas agreed, "is more than I deserve and more than I expected. I'll take it gladly." The formal charges against Harlan Boyd were filed within the month. The investigation's findings, damning enough that even the friendliest of Boyd's old allies could find no path to defend him publicly. Vivian Ashford's trial followed close behind, her father's own reputation collapsing alongside hers as the full scope of the scheme became public record. A decade of manufactured debts, ruined families, and quiet patient cruelty finally dragged into a light it could no longer survive. Constance Whitlock was never formally charged. The evidence against her, judged insufficient to prove criminal intent rather than simple willful complicity, but the county's judgment proved harsher than any court's. Doors that had once opened readily for a Whitlock closed quietly against her. Invitations dried up, and Constance Whitlock, who had spent 30 years ruling Whitlock Ridge with an iron and unyielding will, found herself, for the first time in her life, genuinely and thoroughly alone. Margaret felt, watching that particular reckoning unfold from a careful distance, no triumph in it. Only a quiet, settled sense that the world had finally imperfectly begun to right an old and patient wrong. Sarah Pruitt recovered fully within weeks, her fury at Boyd's cruelty settling into something closer to fierce, satisfied vindication once his formal conviction was announced. And Rebecca Alcott, freed at last from 2 years of believing her own father a failure rather than a victim, wept openly in Whitfield's office the day the county formally cleared her father's name. And Margaret Doyle, she had stopped weeks ago, now thinking of herself as Margaret Whitlock, though she had not yet fully decided what name she meant to carry forward, stood in Sarah Pruitt's garden one warm evening, her father's ledger finally fully at rest, and felt her child move within her. For the first time, a small, certain flutter that stole the breath clean out of her chest. She placed her hand over the place where she'd felt it and found herself unexpectedly smiling. Whatever came next, however long it took to decide what trust with Silas might yet look like, however long the Ridge took to rebuild honestly, from whatever remained after the reckoning finished. Settling, she understood. Standing there in the fading gold light, with her father's proof finally fully vindicated, that she was no longer the woman who had once stood frozen behind a study door, believing her own worth had already been decided by someone else's careless words. She had built something of her own now. Proof. Justice. A future no longer dictated by anyone's arithmetic, but her own. Boyd's formal trial began on a morning heavy with autumn rain, and Margaret sat beside Whitfield in the crowded Danville courthouse, with her hand resting unconsciously over the small swell of her stomach, watching the man who had destroyed her father sit in chains for the first time since she'd known his name. She had expected satisfaction. What she felt instead, watching Boyd's lawyer stumble through a defense built on nothing but desperation, was something quieter and stranger, a kind of exhausted relief. The particular feeling of setting down a weight she'd carried so long, she'd forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. "The prosecution rests," the county attorney said, and the courtroom held its breath. It should have ended there. Margaret understood later that she had allowed herself one dangerous moment of believing it might. "If the court will indulge one final matter," a new voice said, and Margaret's stomach dropped as Councilman Ashford himself rose from the gallery, his silver hair immaculate, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once in his life doubted that a room would listen when he spoke. "Councilman," the magistrate said, startled, "this is highly irregular. I understand irregularity is precisely the accusation being leveled at my daughter," Ashford said smoothly, "which is why I feel compelled to speak. I have served this county for 20 years. I would ask the court to consider what precedent it sets convicting a respected businessman and implicating a respected family on the word of a runaway wife with every motive to fabricate a grievance against the husband who once discarded her." The courtroom murmured, and Margaret felt old fear rise in her chest. The familiar sickening sense of watching her own credibility weighed against a powerful man's reputation. "I did not discard her," Silas said, rising sharply beside Margaret. "I withdrew every claim against her publicly testified against my own father's memory, and severed my family's fortune from Boyd's scheme entirely. If the councilman wishes to discuss discarding, perhaps he should explain his own daughter's payments traced through bank records that survived a fire his associates very likely set." "That is a serious accusation," Ashford said, color rising in his composed face. "It is a documented fact," Whitfield said, standing now as well. "Entered into evidence 3 weeks past, Councilman, and confirmed by Mr. Pratt's testimony under oath. I'd remind the court that interrupting a concluded prosecution to relitigate settled evidence is itself rather irregular." The magistrate's gavel cracked sharp against his desk. "Councilman Ashford, you will take your seat, or I will have you removed from this courtroom," the magistrate said, his patience visibly thinning. "This court has heard sworn testimony, examined bank records, and reviewed a decade of documented correspondence. I will not permit a councilman's reputation to outweigh evidence simply because he arrived to speak loudly on his own behalf." Ashford's jaw tightened, but he sat, and Margaret felt the courtroom's tension ease by degrees, though her own heart continued hammering long after his voice had fallen silent. The verdict came 2 days later, and Margaret stood in the courthouse hallway, with Silas's hand steady at her back, waiting for words that would either finally close the wound her father's death had left open for 2 long years, or tear it freshly open all over again. "Harlan Boyd," the magistrate read, his voice carrying clear through the packed room, "guilty on all counts of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Sentenced to 12 years imprisonment with full restitution, ordered to the families of Thomas Doyle and the late Josiah Alcott to be paid from the remaining unfrozen portion of the defendant's estate." The courtroom erupted, and Margaret felt her knees go weak with a relief so total it stole the breath from her chest. Beside her, Rebecca Alcott had begun to weep openly, her husband's arms wrapped tight around her, and Sarah Pruitt, seated just behind them, reached forward to grip Margaret's shoulder with a fierce, trembling hand. "Vivian Ashford," the magistrate continued, quieting the room again, "guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. Sentenced to 5 years imprisonment and formally barred from holding any position of trust or financial authority within this county for the remainder of her life." Margaret did not watch Vivian's face when the sentence was read. She found to her own quiet surprise that she no longer needed to. Whatever satisfaction she might once have hungered for in watching Vivian's downfall, it had already been eclipsed weeks ago by the simpler, deeper satisfaction of her father's name finally publicly cleared. "It's done," she whispered to no one, to herself. To the ghost of her father, she still sometimes felt watching over her careful handwriting in his old ledger. "It's finally done." "Almost," Silas said quietly beside her. "One thing left." Constance Whitlock received the news of Boyd's conviction alone in the study she had once ruled with an iron will, and when Margaret and Silas arrived at Whitlock Ridge that evening, they found her sitting in near darkness. A single candle burned low, her composed face finally fully stripped of the certainty that had carried her through 30 years of quiet complicity. "I suppose you've come to gloat," Constance said without turning. "I've come," Silas said, "to tell you I'm selling the eastern parcels effective immediately to begin repaying what remains owed to the families your husband and Boyd destroyed together. I've come to tell you that whatever portion of this estate you retain going forward will be earned honestly from this day, or not retained at all." Constance turned then, and Margaret saw something in her face she had never once expected to see there. Not quite grief, not quite fear, but something adjacent to both the particular devastation of a woman watching the entire architecture of her life collapse at once. "Your father built this house believing strength meant never admitting weakness," Constance said quietly. "I raised you the same way. I don't know how to be anything else, Silas. I don't know what remains of me once the pretense is gone." "Then perhaps," Margaret said, surprising herself as much as Constance, "it's time to learn." Constance's eyes moved to her sharp and startled. "I lost everything once," Margaret continued. "My father, my fortune, my name, everything I believed made me who I was. I learned in the losing of it that I was considerably more than any of those things. I don't offer you forgiveness, Constance. I don't believe you've earned it, and I'm not certain you ever will. But I offer you the same chance I was given, unasked by a farm widow who owed me nothing. The chance to become someone worth knowing once everything false has finally burned away." Constance said nothing for a long moment, and Margaret did not wait for an answer. She turned and left the study and did not look back to see whether the words had landed anywhere real, understanding that whatever Constance chose to build from what remained of her life was no longer, and had perhaps never truly been, Margaret's burden to carry. Winter came hard and early that year, and Margaret spent much of it at Sarah Pruitt's farm. Still her belly grown round and heavy, watching the world outside the kitchen window turn white and quiet, in a way that felt after months of fear and fury almost peaceful. Silas visited often, not as a husband claiming his due. Margaret had made that boundary clear from the first week after the trial concluded. But as a man courting slowly and carefully a trust he understood he had no right yet to assume. "You didn't have to bring firewood," Margaret said, one bitter evening, watching him stack split logs against Sarah's porch with the careful, unhurried focus of a man who had spent 30 years never once splitting wood himself before this winter. "I wanted to," Silas said, straightening his breath, fogging in the cold air. "There's a particular satisfaction in useful labor, Margaret. I spent 30 years believing usefulness meant signing contracts and negotiating land. I'm discovering it might mean something considerably simpler." "The Ridge," Margaret said. "How does it fare now that half the eastern land is sold?" "Smaller," Silas admitted. "Considerably smaller. I've let go of most of the household staff, kept only Otis and a handful who chose to stay, despite the reduced wages I can offer them now. I work the remaining land myself most days. It's humbling in a way I suspect I needed considerably more than I ever wanted." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, and found she genuinely wanted to know the answer, not simply as a courtesy, but as something that mattered to her unexpectedly and entirely. Silas considered the question with the same careful seriousness he'd brought to every question since the trial's end. "I'm tired," he said finally. "Tired in a way I never was negotiating contracts in a warm study. But it's an honest, tired Margaret. I sleep better now than I did in 3 years of easy comfort built on lies I never questioned. I think that might be closer to happiness than anything I knew before." Margaret watched him a moment longer. This man rebuilding himself as carefully and deliberately as he was rebuilding his fortune, and felt something in her chest that she had been guarding fiercely for months finally cautiously begin to loosen. "Stay for supper," she said. "Sarah made more stew than the two of us can manage." It was a small thing. She understood, even as she said it, that it was also considerably larger than it appeared the first invitation she had freely offered him since the night she'd fled Whitlock Ridge in the dark. The first small proof that trust, however carefully rationed, had begun quietly to rebuild itself alongside everything else. The child came in early spring, 3 weeks earlier than the midwife had predicted, on a night thick with the particular chaos of new life insisting on its own timing, regardless of anyone's readiness. Margaret labored through the long hours in Sarah's farmhouse, with Sarah herself at her side. Steady and unshaken, having buried 2 children of her own and birthed 4 more over a lifetime, that had taught her exactly how to hold a frightened woman's hand through the worst of it. "You're doing fine," Sarah said again and again through hours that felt to Margaret like they might never end. "Strongest woman I ever met, and I've met plenty. This is just one more hard thing you're going to get through, same as all the rest." Silas paced the hallway outside, having been firmly and repeatedly banished by Sarah from the birthing room itself, and it was Otis waiting with him through the long night who finally spoke the thought Silas had clearly been circling for hours. "You look like a man expecting bad news," Otis said. "I look," Silas admitted, "like a man who understands for the first time exactly how much he stands to lose and exactly how little control he has over losing it." "Welcome to fatherhood," Otis said, not unkindly. "Best get used to that particular feeling, son. It don't ever fully go away." The child arrived just before dawn. A daughter small and furious and startlingly loud for something so newly arrived in the world. And when Sarah finally allowed Silas into the room, Margaret, exhausted and radiant against the pillows, with their daughter cradled against her chest, he stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, unable to move at all. "May I?" he asked, finally his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Come here," Margaret said, and something in her voice, gentle and unguarded in a way it hadn't been since the night everything between them had broken, made his eyes go bright with tears. He didn't bother wiping away. He crossed to the bed slowly, as though approaching something too fragile and too precious to risk startling. And when Margaret placed their daughter carefully into his arms, Margaret watched a man who had once negotiated land purchases with cold, practiced calm, come utterly, completely undone. "She's perfect," Silas whispered, staring down at the small, furious face blinking up at him. "Margaret, she's absolutely perfect." "What will we call her?" Margaret asked. Silas looked up from their daughter's face, meeting Margaret's eyes with something that had never once been present in the early months of their marriage. Not obligation, not arrangement, but something real and unguarded and entirely finally honest. "Grace," he said, "if you'll have it, for everything it took both of us to finally earn." Margaret felt tears rise unexpected and unstoppable. "Grace," she agreed. "Grace Doyle Whitlock." They did not marry again, not formally. The original vows, spoken under circumstances neither of them wished to fully reclaim, remained legally binding, whether either of them chose to honor the spirit of them or not. But 3 months after Grace's birth, on a warm spring evening in Sarah Pruitt's garden, surrounded by the small, fierce community of people who had carried Margaret through the worst months of her life, Silas asked Margaret a question that mattered considerably more to both of them than any legal ceremony ever could. "I'm not asking you to move back to the Ridge," he said. Grace asleep against his shoulder, his voice careful in the particular way he'd learned over months of patient rebuilding, always to be careful with Margaret's trust. "I'm not asking you for anything. You're not ready to give freely. I'm only asking whether you'd consider it. Whether there's a version of us built honestly this time that you might someday want." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. This man who had once let cruelty stand unanswered in a darkened study, who had transformed himself slowly, and at enormous cost, into someone who had stood between her and a loaded threat, who had testified against his own mother, who had rebuilt an entire fortune from the ground up, rather than keep a single dollar of dishonest inheritance, who now stood before her in a farm widow's garden with their daughter asleep against his shoulder, asking not for what he was owed, but only for what she might someday be willing to offer. "I don't want the Ridge as it was," she said finally. "I don't want silent suppers and empty chairs and a household run on my invisibility. If there's a version of us worth building, Silas, it has to be built on something entirely different than what we started with." "Then help me build it," Silas said. "Not as the wife I once treated as an arrangement. As a partner, Margaret. Someone whose voice matters in every decision this family makes going forward from the smallest to the largest. I can't undo what I let stand that night. I can only prove every day going forward that it will never stand again." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching their daughter sleep peacefully against her father's shoulder, watching the man who had once been nearly a stranger to her transform slowly and deliberately into someone she found herself cautiously and honestly beginning to trust. "Then I'll come home," she said finally, "not as the woman who left in the dark, as the woman who built her own case, found her own proof, and chose, in the end, to come back on her own terms, rather than anyone else's." The Whitlock Ridge. Margaret returned to that summer bore little resemblance to the estate she had fled nearly a year before. Smaller now, humbler, the great house's east wing, closed off and unused, the household staff reduced to a handful who worked alongside Silas, rather than merely for him. But it was Margaret found walking through rooms that had once felt like a cage dressed up as a home, considerably more alive than it had ever been during the brief cold months of her first arrival. She brought her father's ledger with her, restored now to its rightful place, and set it carefully on a shelf in the study, where the terrible conversation that had once driven her into the night had taken place. Not as a monument to grief, she told Silas, but as a reminder of what silence cost, and what proof could accomplish, and what a woman determined enough could rebuild from nothing but her own dignity and her own careful hand. Rebecca Alcott visited often that first summer, her own family's fortune slowly rebuilding, as the restitution from Boyd's conviction finally began arriving, and Sarah Pruitt became, in every way that mattered, beyond blood, a grandmother to small Grace, who grew fat and happy, and entirely unaware of how narrowly her mother had once fought for the life she now took utterly for granted. Constance Whitlock did not remain at the Ridge. She took a small house in town, modest and entirely her own, and Margaret heard second-hand, and without particular interest, that she had begun slowly to build something resembling an honest life from what remained of her fortune and her reputation both. Margaret did not seek her out, and Constance did not seek forgiveness she had not yet earned. It was Margaret decided exactly the arrangement that suited them both. It was nearly a year to the day since Margaret had stood frozen behind a study door, listening to her own worth get laughed away in another woman's careless voice, when she stood instead in that same study's doorway, watching Silas rock their daughter to sleep by lamplight, humming some rough, tuneless melody that Grace seemed nonetheless to find entirely soothing. "You're staring," Silas said without looking up. "I'm remembering," Margaret said. "This room, what it used to hold." Silas looked up then, understanding immediately what she meant, and something careful and searching crossed his face. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. "Standing here." Margaret considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned over the long, hard months of building her case and rebuilding her life, always to consider things honestly, rather than simply offering the answer easiest to give. "Less than it used to," she said. "I think it always will some. A wound like that doesn't close so completely it forgets it was ever a wound. But I've learned something this past year I didn't know before, standing frozen behind that door, believing my worth had already been decided without my consent." "What's that?" "That a woman's value was never truly Silas Whitlock's to decide," Margaret said, "or Harlan Boyd's, or Vivian Ashford's, or anyone's but her own. I spent 3 months in this house believing myself small because the people around me treated me as though I were. I learned out there alone with nothing but a stolen horse and my father's ledger that I had simply never yet been given the chance to discover how much I actually carried inside me. Silas rose carefully, Grace still sleeping soundly against his shoulder, and crossed the small distance between them. I don't deserve what you've chosen to rebuild with me, he said quietly. I understand that. I understood it the day you agreed to come home, and I understand it every single day since. But I promise you, Margaret, for as long as I have breath to promise it, I will spend every remaining year of my life proving myself worthy of the choice you've made, rather than assuming ever again that it was owed to me simply by right. Margaret reached up, resting her hand against his jaw, feeling the warmth of him, the steadiness that had finally slowly replaced the cold arithmetic that had once defined every word he spoke to her. That, she said softly, is all I ever wanted, Silas. Not perfection, not a man who never once made a mistake. Only a man willing to keep choosing me honestly every single day, for exactly as long as it takes to earn back what silence nearly destroyed. Autumn returned once more to Whitlock Ridge, gentler. This time, the harvest smaller, but honestly earned, and Margaret stood in the garden with Grace toddling unsteadily across the grass, chasing something only a 1-year-old could find endlessly fascinating, while Silas worked the near field with Otis, both men's laughter carrying faint and warm across the evening air. Sarah Pruitt sat beside her on the garden bench, watching the same scene with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had helped build it from nothing but flower bin hiding places and stubborn kindness. Never thought I'd see the day, Sarah said, a Whitlock working his own field like a common farmer laughing while he did it. Neither did I, Margaret admitted. Neither I think did he. You did that, Sarah said. Don't go giving all the credit to some slow, gradual change in his own character. You walked into that mercantile a year past with nothing but a bag and a horse that wasn't yours, and you built an entire case against powerful men out of pure stubbornness and your father's careful handwriting. That's not luck, Margaret. That's a woman who refused to accept the world's first answer as the only one available to her. Margaret watched Grace stumble and fall in the soft grass, watched her rise again immediately, undeterred, chasing after whatever had caught her attention with the fearless persistence only a child too young to know failure could manage, and felt something settle deep and permanent in her chest. I used to believe, she said slowly, that leaving Whitlock Ridge that night was the bravest thing I'd ever do. I understand now it was only the first brave thing. Everything after the ledger, the lawyer Rebecca's testimony standing in that courtroom in front of the whole county and refusing to be silenced. That was the real courage. Leaving was simply where it started. And where's it end? Sarah asked, with the particular dry humor Margaret had come to treasure in her. Margaret watched her daughter rise once more from the grass, watched her husband look up from the field and wave, watched an entire life rebuilt from the wreckage of a single overheard conversation, stretch out warm and honest and entirely her own in front of her. It doesn't end, Margaret said finally. It simply becomes the life I chose to build one honest day at a time, for as long as I have left to build it. She rose from the bench and crossed the garden to lift her daughter into her arms, and Grace laughed bright and unguarded, and reached her small hands toward her father, crossing the field to meet them both. Margaret Doyle Whitlock stood in the fading autumn light of a home, finally fully her own, and understood with a certainty that had taken a year of fear and fury and stubborn, unbreakable resolve to earn that no man's careless words would ever again decide what she believed herself worth. She had proven that truth to an entire county, in a crowded courthouse, with her father's ledger open before a magistrate who had finally fully listened. She had proven it to herself first on a dark road out of Whitlock Ridge, with nothing but a stolen horse and a stubborn refusal to remain invisible one moment longer. And she would go on proving it every single day that followed, for as long as she had breath left to live it.